The year is 1987, and American TV networks launch a number of short-lived shows such as Starman, The Popcorn Kid, and Probe. In a fit of midlife nostalgia and an effort to remind the world of shows they have forgotten, lone podcast pilot Chris Cooling steps into the Forgotten TV studio 30 years later. Well-remembered to obscure TV memories of the 70s and 80s, including short-lived TV shows and made-for-TV movies, this is Forgotten TV. Welcome to Forgotten TV. I am your host, Chris Cooling. Forgotten TV is an independent, listener-supported podcast. You can support Forgotten TV through Patreon or PayPal and become a producer of the show. Or buy me a coffee without joining anything. This episode of Forgotten TV was executive produced by Doc Pinko, Joshua Driscoll, K.L. Young, Kenny Siegel, and Tony Cook. You can also support this podcast by using the Forgotten TV affiliate links found on the website and show notes. Thanks to all for your support of Forgotten TV. It was a rainy afternoon in the summer of 1975. Harry Nilsson was playing on the vintage Zenith wood grain floor model radio. Young Chris was visiting his nanny and papa and had just been treated to a mid-afternoon snack, a fresh, homemade pecan pie. Sitting cross-legged in the air-conditioned living room, he cracked open The Clue of the Screeching Owl by Franklin W. Dixon. The cover illustration by Rudy Nappy promised adventure and mystery, and he could almost hear the faint rustling of leaves from the fictional woods. Enraptured, he turned the pages, the outside world fading into the background, as he joined Frank and Joe Hardy on the wooded adventure. That afternoon, it was just him, the brothers, and the mystery they had to solve. A perfect escape from the rainy and hot summer day. It's pretty common knowledge today, but a few years later, I was surprised to learn that there was no such person as Franklin W. Dixon. And for that matter, no Carolyn Keene of Nancy Drew, no Laura Lee Hope of the Bobbsey Twins, no Victor Appleton of Tom Swift, and the list goes on. All these book series were the brainchild of Edward Stratemeyer, who created the wildly successful Stratemeyer Syndicate in 1905. In this year, at the dawn of the 20th century, Variety magazine had just begun publication in New York City. America's first theater, devoted exclusively to moving pictures, was opened in Pittsburgh. Its founders called the place Nickelodeon, from the price of admission, a nickel, and Odeon, the ancient Greek word for theater. America's first pizzeria opened on the corner of Spring and Mott in Manhattan, and the motor car was gaining popularity as Ford releases the Model F touring car. Realizing the potential of a huge untapped market, Stratemeyer became the first book packager to market primarily to children. He sought to produce books in an assembly line process, with a formula designed to appeal to the target audience. This was accomplished by hiring a network of freelance ghostwriters to churn out work for a flat fee, with writers expected to produce a book in about a month's time. Book series were then attributed to a consistent pseudonym. The books came to be known as 50-cent juveniles, named after the cover price and intended audience. Stratemeyer's first book series was The Rover Boys, penned by himself and published under the pseudonym Arthur M. Winfield, released in 30 volumes between 1899 and 1926. Almost completely forgotten today, the Rover Boys were three brothers, Tom, Dick, and Sam, who were the sons of a wealthy widower who left their rearing to his brother Randolph and his wife Martha. In the first book, the boys were in military school, then went on adventures on the open sea, in the jungles of Africa, and various locales in the continental U.S. The stories incorporated the latest technologies of travel, such as the motor car and airplane. Later installments included mystery and suspense. The Rover Boys series proved quite popular, selling over 5 million copies, and proved to be the prototype for future book series, such as the Bobbsey Twins, debuting in 1904, and Tom Swift in 1910. By this time, Grosset and Dunlap had signed on as the Syndicate's publisher. The Rover Boys had numerous mentions in pop culture up to the 1960s, but often in a fleeting reference easy to miss if you weren't aware of the characters. Lines referencing the Rover Boys were found in the Robert Mitchum film Maceo from 1952, The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet 1953 episode Rover Boys, the 1955 MGM musical It's Always Fair Weather, a 1965 episode of I Spy, a 1966 episode of Dark Shadows, and a 1967 episode of The Andy Griffith Show. The success of the Rover Boys led to a slew of book series. There were the Motorcycle Chums, the Speedwell Boys, the Boy Aviators, the Racer Boys, the Motion Picture Chums, the Radio Boys, Bamba the Jungle Boy, and the list went on, totaling some 70 different book series. After finding mystery novels to be popular, one Leslie McFarlane was engaged to ghostwrite a new mystery series aimed at young boys, based on an outline for the initial novel that had been penned by Stratemeyer. Raised in the town of Haileybury, Ontario, McFarlane picked up writing early on, winning a writing contest at age 13. Soon after high school, he began working as a newspaper journalist for the Cobalt Daily Nugget, and later for the Springfield Republican in Massachusetts. He quickly found newspaper reporting to be completely unlike how it was depicted in Hollywood films. He continued to write fiction, having an early story published in Adventure magazine. In 1926, actor Alan Dinehart was calling, wanting to buy the rights for $500 to turn his story into a stage play. This would amount to about $9,000 today. McFarlane turned down the offer. If anyone was going to turn his story into a stage play, it would be him. Mornings were then devoted to writing, and afternoons were spent at the newspaper. One day, a letter arrived with a return address from the Stratemeyer Syndicate. McFarlane had almost forgotten about the classified ad he answered 3 weeks earlier. Experienced fiction writer wanted to work from publisher's outlines, with a box number listed. McFarlane was educated on the inner workings of the operation, where ghostwriters cranked out volumes for book series. He was shocked to learn that Roy Rockwood, creator of Bamba the Jungle Boy, a book series he had enjoyed as a teen, didn't really exist. A proposal to write 2 test chapters from an outline was made, and if acceptable, McFarlane would be paid a flat rate of $100 for a 20-chapter manuscript. No royalty, but with the likelihood of future work. McFarlane was soon cranking out a volume of Dave Fearless, a deep-sea adventure series using the Roy Rockwood pseudonym. He soon had a check for $100 and an outline for a second volume. The play was all but forgotten, and McFarlane gave his notice at the Republican. Moving back to Canada, he pecked away daily at his typewriter. Living in the cabin on Lake Ramsey, Ontario, he rented for $100 a year. One day his check arrived, but with no new outline for a subsequent book. After a week passed, a new letter from Stratemeyer came, outlining the concept for a series based on a pair of brothers who would become the boy detectives we're all now familiar with. This series would pay a rate of $125 per book, but McFarlane would still give up all rights of ownership and sign an NDA, swearing him to secrecy involving his authorship of any Stratemeyer publication. It wasn't until the 1950s that his connection to the Hardy Boys became known. For many years, it was believed that Edward Stratemeyer came up with the pseudonym Franklin W. Dixon, the name all Hardy Boys books would be attributed to. However, a 1996 email from McFarlane's great-nephew Scott, written to Robert Finnan of the Hardy Boys' unofficial homepage, claimed the pseudonym was invented by McFarlane himself, based on the names of his two brothers, Franklin from his brother Frank, W from his brother Wilmot, and Dixon from Wilmot's nickname, Dick. Over the years, McFarlane also continued to write dozens of articles for national magazines, like Maclean's, where he also became editor. Later in his career, he became a producer-director for the National Film Board of Canada and made some 50 documentaries and short films, including one nominated for an Academy Award. He also had a job overseeing scripts for the CBC and wrote some 70 scripts himself for radio and television, many of which are missing from his IMDb. Several of his productions featured actor Lorne Greene, and McFarlane later wrote an episode for Bonanza prior to his death in 1977. But let's dial it back 50 years and look at the introduction of the Hardy Boys. From the original Stratemeyer cast description notes, the setting was the fictional Bayport, described as a pleasant city of 50,000 people on Barmet Bay, which opens 3 miles down on the Atlantic Ocean. The tall, dark-haired Frank Hardy, 16, was reasoned, logical, and serious, while the younger, more athletic Joe, 15, with fair, curly hair, was impetuous, emotional, and something of a jokester. Even though a year apart in age, the boys attended the same grade at Bayport High School, due to a vague illness Frank once had that held him back a year. Their father, Fenton Hardy, was aged 40 and a well-known private detective. Mrs. Hardy was small and slim and had a sweet voice. She is left out of most television adaptations. The boys' Aunt Gertrude was peppery and dictatorial. The boys had 3 main chums: Chet, the chubby farm boy who provided comic relief, Biff, the athletic two-fisted type, and Tony, intended as minority representation. Note that in this era, Italians were considered non-white. Occasionally, Iola Morton, Chet's plump and dark sister, and brown-haired Callie Shaw would show up. Serving as sort of platonic girlfriends, Frank thought Callie was great, and Joe thought Iola was okay for a girl. After all, the Hardy Boys characters would remain chaste, with none of this backseat petting that was starting to work its way into popular fiction of the day. The boys were strong, athletic, brave, and resourceful. Among the skills depicted were mechanical aptitude, outdoorsmanship, scuba diving, piloting aircraft, animal tracking, the ability to speak in sign language and Spanish, and how to handle a gun. The Hardys were evidently quite well off financially, with a home gym, possessing various forms of motorized transport, and the freedom to travel the world. In May 1927, 3 volumes of the Hardy Boys was released in what was called a breeder set. These included The Tower Treasure, The House on the Cliff, and The Secret of the Old Mill. In just 2 years, the books had sold over 115,000 copies. McFarlane ended up writing either 19 or 21 of the first 24 volumes, depending on the source you read. The month The Hardy Boys was released onto the world, one Mildred Augustine Wirt was receiving her master's degree in journalism from University of Iowa. Mildred had also responded to an ad from the Stratemeyer Syndicate and had been writing since early high school when she had a short story published in a magazine. Stratemeyer put her to work ghostwriting novels in the established Ruth Fielding series. A year later, noting both the popularity of the Ruth Fielding series of books and the current craze over mystery novels, driven largely by Agatha Christie, Stratemeyer sought to add a series of bright, vigorous stories for older girls, having to do with the solving of several mysteries. That character would be named Nancy Drew and would be attributed to the pseudonym Carolyn Keene, a name that had previously been used for the book series The Dana Girls, the first 4 volumes of which had been penned by Leslie McFarlane. Stratemeyer provided Mildred with an outline, and work on the first book began. Unlike Mildred's portrayal of female characters she had presented in the Ruth Fielding stories, Stratemeyer's instructions were that the Nancy Drew character display less feminine niceties and more bravado and adventurousness. In other words, a female counterpart to the Hardy Boys. Nancy's father, Carson Drew, would be a successful attorney, often called away on business. George Fane was introduced as the tomboyish, loyal friend to Nancy, as was boyfriend Ned Nickerson, student at Emerson College, introduced in the 7th volume. All lived in the fictional Midwestern burg of River Heights. 16 days after providing the outline for the first novel, the stock market crashed, and the Depression arrived. Thus, 16-year-old Nancy Drew, with her smart tweed suits, fancy dresses, and shiny new blue roadster, a birthday gift from father, represented the prosperous 1920s, and not the new reality much of America was now in. In fact, having graduated school, she seemed to have no worries about money, career, or marriage. Both Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys, with their seemingly endless access to motor cars, motorbikes, and boats, not only offered young readers an escapist story to lose themselves in, but also would present a fantasy that was a far cry from the brother can you spare a dime reality of breadlines and soup kitchens that much of working America found themselves in. Nancy Drew made her debut in 1930 in a breeder set, which included The Secret of the Old Clock, The Hidden Staircase, and The Bungalow Mystery. 12 days after the launching of Nancy Drew, Edward Stratemeyer died from pneumonia at his home in Newark at the age of 67. The syndicate was left to daughters Harriet Stratemeyer Adams and Edna Camilla Stratemeyer, who continued to operate it for decades. However, Nancy Drew was an immediate success, as the girl detective along with the Hardy Boys seemed to thumb their nose at the Depression. 15 volumes of Nancy Drew had been printed, by the time a major film studio expressed interest in the series. It was perhaps inevitable that our favorite brothers and girl detective would leap out of books and into other media. But you might be surprised to learn that Nancy Drew made the leap first. Only 8 years after being introduced, she went from the page to the big screen in Nancy Drew, Detective.
Come on, hurry up!
Now look here, Nancy Drew. Your dad said that...
It's the kidnap car. We gotta follow them.
Kidnap car? Gosh!
You care anything for the brat, and I think you do. Drop that. You'll keep her out of our way. From now on, you're going to be watched. And the first move she makes, something happens.
Ted, look. There's somebody trying to break into our house. It's probably one of the crooks. You tackle him and... I'll hit him over the head with this wrench.
Okay, but hit him.
Yeah.
In 1937, Warner Brothers bought the film rights to Nancy Drew for $6,000, intending to make a series of B pictures in the style of the Torchy Blane films. Harriet Stratemeyer Adams had reportedly sold the rights on her own, with no legal consultation, which she would come to regret. Released in November 1938, Nancy Drew, Detective, starred Benita Granville in the title role. The plot was based on Book 10, The Password to Larkspur Lane. The first Nancy Drew film was followed by 3 in quick succession. Nancy Drew, Reporter, Nancy Drew, Troubleshooter, and Nancy Drew and the Hidden Staircase, all released in 1939. Rounding out the cast were John Lytle as Carson Drew and Frankie Thomas as Ted Nickerson, as Warner gave the character a different first name for no good reason. These were all light-hearted fare, barely over an hour long. The films took a number of liberties with the original source material, portraying Nancy as ditzy and absent-minded, the complete opposite of the way the character was portrayed in the books. This was seemingly contradictory to the print ads for the films, proclaiming, "One side, flat feet, let a real sleuth show you how it's done." Or, "Meet the toughest sleuth who's ever captured your heart. It's none other than that master manhunter, that champ criminologist, Nancy Drew, Detective." Major alterations were done to virtually all the characters, and the tone of storytelling was also quite different. Harriet Adams wasn't pleased with the films, and was said to have resented the studio for their treatment of the character. Still, employees reported that she kept an autographed photo of Benita Granville on her desk for many years. In what would become de rigueur for adaptations, cross-promotional marketing was implemented, with an in-store promotional wrapper on copies of The Password to Larkspur Lane, proclaiming, "This is the book from which the Warner Brothers photoplay, Nancy Drew, Detective, was made." However, the films and cross-promotion did not seem to increase book sales. There was also a fan club kit distributed by the studio, which came with autographed photos of Granville and the ability to order a membership card and detective badge for 30 cents each. A set of now hilarious rules were included, indicating girls should have a steady boyfriend, in the sense of a pal, not engage in smoking, drinking, or petting, and that girls should pay their own way on dates and consider plans for a career. Needing little help from the Warner films, by 1940, the Nancy Drew book series had sold about 2.5 million copies. The Hardy Boys, 1956 Mickey Mouse Club serial. Even though Nancy Drew had seen some success with theatrical films, the Hardy Boys stayed in book form with no theatrical adaptation. Mark Connolly notes in his excellent guide through the history of the Hardy Boys that there may have been reservations about developing Hardy Boys films due to possible confusion with the Andy Hardy films popular in this era. However, the Hardy Boys would make it to the small screen in the second season of the popular weekday afternoon program, The Mickey Mouse Club.
The Mickey Mouse Club, brought to you by the ABC Television Network 5 days a week, Monday through Friday.
On February 7th, 1956, Disney bought the rights to all Hardy Boys books then published, including not only film and TV adaptations of stories, but also to licensed merchandise for a sum of $5,700. Bill Walsh was assigned to produce, and the prolific Jackson Gillis was engaged to loosely adapt The Tower Treasure, the initial 1927 Hardy Boys book, into a series of 19 15-minute episodes. Gillis was known for writing for Adventures of Superman and Lassie, and later had a long career with Perry Mason, Tarzan, Lost in Space, and just about everything you remember from 1970s TV. The Mystery of the Applegate Treasure featured 15-year-old Tim Considine as Frank Hardy and 14-year-old Tommy Kirk as Joe Hardy. The more well-known Considine had already appeared in the Mickey Mouse Club's previous live-action serial, The Adventures of Spin and Marty. Following Mickey Mouse Club, Considine appeared as Mike, one of my three sons, during the first 5 years of that long-running sitcom. This was perhaps Tommy Kirk's 7th or 8th appearance on television in rapid succession, but it was his first starring role. He was reportedly selected after the studio conducted an extensive series of screen tests, in which at least 9 boys tested for the role of Joe. Kirk was soon packaged as the All-American Boy, sent by Disney to attend both the Republican and Democratic national conventions that year for newsreel segments. He was then seen on numerous Disney TV and film productions throughout the 50s and 60s, including iconic appearances in Old Yeller, The Shaggy Dog, and Swiss Family Robinson. But here, keeping in line with the young audience, the rather rambunctious Hardy Boys were portrayed as being much younger than in the books, possibly intended to be as young as 11 and 12 years old. Thus, the boys would only get around the now suburban Bayport on their bicycles, and not any of the motorized transportation the books made exciting.
Gold doubloons and pieces of 8, handed down to Applegate, from buccaneers who fought for years for gold doubloons and pieces of 8, handed down in a pirate's chest, the gold they sailed for east and west, the treasure bright that made men fight, till none were left to bury the chest. So now the gold and pieces of 8 all belong to Applegate. The chest is here, but wait. Now, where are those gold doubloons and pieces of 8, pieces of 8, pieces of 8?
The Hardy Boys, featuring Tim Considine and Tommy Kirk in The Mystery of the Applegate Treasure.
The story followed the Hardy Boys as an investigation into stolen tools leads to one revolving around a missing treasure. Their friend Iola is attacked and robbed by a stranger, leading the boys to the decaying mansion of Silas Applegate, and they learn about a local legend of Applegate's missing treasure. The boys end up tracking down the missing treasure hidden in a rundown railroad water tower. In something that would become typical in the TV adaptations, no mother was in sight, with Aunt Gertrude being the matronly stand-in. Footage used in the opening segment was taken from 1950's Treasure Island. The theme song was performed by Disney regular Thurl Ravenscroft, who was known as the voice of Tony the Tiger of the Kellogg's Frosted Flakes commercials for over 50 years. Although much of the story takes place outdoors, almost the entire production was filmed on Disney's large Stage 2. The following years, The Mystery of Ghost Farm was again written by Gillis and presented the now clearly older boys investigating a haunted farm where Joe is greatly irritated at Frank's discovery of girls. Yuck. This story was a Gillis original and not linked to any Hardy Boys book. 14 10-minute chapters were produced. Disney was something of a marketing machine, and the Mickey Mouse Club versions of the Hardy Boys were not excluded from their merchandising efforts. In 1957, the companion magazine to the Mickey Mouse Club printed condensed versions of the books The Shore Road Mystery and The House on the Cliff. Dell released 4 Hardy Boys comic books with Tim Considine and Tommy Kirk on their covers, 2 based on the serials that had aired, and 2 based on the books The Secret of the Old Mill and The Mystery of the Caves. Licensed merchandise also included Whitman coloring books, a Parker Brother board game, 33, 45, and 78 RPM records, and promotional book wrappers that served as an ad for the show. Oddly, Tommy Kirk did not appear on all the tie-in merchandise, with an unnamed actor sometimes standing in for him. During these years, Parker Brothers also released the Nancy Drew mystery board game, and a decade later, Madame Alexander released a collectible doll series. With the Mickey Mouse Club seen by an estimated audience of 14 million viewers, this drew new attention to the Hardy Boys book series. Now blessed by Disney, the books started showing up in some school libraries for the first time. While previously academics and librarians had turned their noses up at Stratemeyer Syndicate books, writing them off as juvenile rubbish, not worthy of inclusion, by the late 50s, with the overwhelming popularity of television, many of these critics were just glad kids were reading. But baby boomer kids began to notice that the Hardy Boys books, whose oldest stories were now some 3 decades old, were quite dated and full of obsolete references. For example, what kid in the late 50s knew what an automat, wireless, roadster, or touring car was? Even more troubling were the outdated racial stereotypes, even by late 1950s standards. Descriptions of races and ethnicities included references to shiftless or stupid Negroes, excitable Italians, sinister Chinamen, the odors that certain races supposedly have, and even outright ethnic and racial slurs. When Mr. Applegate bailed the boys out of jail, it was mighty white of him to do so. The early books also contained an unruly, almost nonconformist element as well, with pranks played on adults and disrespect shown toward incompetent police. Attitudes that no longer played well by the late 1950s. Even that bastion of American boyhood, the Boy Scouts of America, whose chief librarian had lambasted the cheap, prolific juvenile fiction since 1914, had banned the books by this time, forbidding members to read them. Thus, it was decided to revise the existing books, removing racist language, outdated slang, references, and phrasing, and updating story elements to reflect the more modern times. The copyright page of the revised books contained the disclaimer. In this new story, based on the original of the same title, Mr. Dixon has incorporated the most up-to-date methods used by police and private detectives. The boys were aged up from 15 and 16 to 17 and 18, and the usage of guns was dropped. Chet was no longer fat, but plump. Iola was no longer plump, but slim, while Callie was now a blonde. But still, the boys continued to show only the most superficial interest in the opposite sex. The writing style was also simplified, plots streamlined, and details shortened. In some cases, entire plots changed. In Book 15, The Sinister Signpost, instead of the plot revolving around a missing racehorse, this was reduced to a side plot as the boys investigated mysterious auto racing accidents. Book 20, The Mystery of the Flying Express, has the titular Express change from a train to a hydrofoil ferry. In Book 22, The Flickering Torch Mystery, the investigation into Asa Grayble's missing silk moths and theft of construction materials is changed to plane crashes and locating contraband uranium. To keep hip with the times, the boys and their chums were now in a rock and roll band. McFarlane's original, sumptuous descriptions of the boys' meals were reduced to short, cold phrasing. All of this resulted in a page count reduction, with the debut book alone shrinking from 240 to 180 pages. Also of note is while originally the Bayport area had a racially diverse population, albeit with the racist descriptions, now references to ethnicity and race were dropped, ironically resulting in a whitewashing of the books. The book covers also got updated with new art by Rudy Nappy, resulting in the covers early Gen Xers are likely familiar with. These rewrites were released from 1959 to 1973. The Nancy Drew series also received the same treatment with revisions, raising her age from 16 to 18, as well as updating other character and story elements.
Now, for every kid who has ever seen a science fiction movie, thrilled to the amazing strength of an out-of-this-world movie monster, comes Great Garloo by Marx. Garloo the Mighty. Garloo the Untamed. Garloo the Terrible. Who can stop him? Who can control this monstrous creature? You can, kids, because Great Garloo by Marx is yours to command. With these battery-operated controls, you can make Garloo go, stop, bend, pick up, turn. Yes, Great Garloo, almost 2 feet tall, will be your faithful servant. You name it, you're the boss. Bring out-of-this-world excitement into your house, kids. Own the most fantastic toy of all. Great Garloo by Marx.
The Mystery of the Chinese Junk, 1967 NBC TV pilot. The next appearance of the Hardy Boys on TV was brought to the screen by Richard Murphy, creator of 60s series The Felony Squad. Produced by 20th Century Fox Television, this was a pilot for a proposed NBC series that failed to sell. NBC aired it as a one-time special on September 8, 1967, at 7:30, 6:30 Central against The Wild Wild West on CBS and the animated Off to See the Wizard on ABC. The film starred Rick Gates as Frank Hardy and Tim Matheson as Joe, and Richard Anderson as Fenton Hardy. The show also featured Jan Michael Vincent and Terry Garr in supporting roles. Frank and Joe buy a Chinese junk, or traditional sailing ship, named Hai Hao, with the intent of turning it into a passenger ferry. Initially attracting attention from some rough dockhands, they soon find multiple parties all too interested in the junk. Based on the 1960 Hardy Boys book of the same title, this was sort of old-school Hardy Boys meets 60s beach movies. Airing only once, this was shelved and is likely the most forgotten of the Hardy Boys adaptations, and not a lot of information is available about this pilot. An existing film print has been digitized and can be found online, but it is faded and rough, in mono with low audio levels. The Hardy Boys, 1969 animated ABC series. When the NBC TV series didn't pan out, Fox Television pitched a Saturday morning animated version of The Hardy Boys to ABC, to be brought to the screen by Filmation in the style of what they had done the prior year with their adaptation of Archie comics. ABC agreed, and Filmation was signed to produce the series for the fall of 1969. Following the trend away from superheroes and far-out fantasy sci-fi that watchdog groups considered too violent, Saturday morning was shifting to a lineup heavy with comedy, music, and mystery. Hanna-Barbera gave us Dastardly and Muttley and Their Flying Machines, The Perils of Penelope Pitstop, and Scooby-Doo. NBC was presenting the live-action costumed weirdness of H.R. Pufnstuf and the Banana Splits. And Filmation had delivered The Archie Show with its musical segments. As they had done with the Archies, a combination story and musical format was adopted, where 2 12-minute mysteries would air in the half-hour program, with a song performed in the middle of the second story. The unique gimmick here was that the show's opening segment and closing credits were performed by a live-action band, billed as the Hardy Boys.
Oh boy, here come the Hardys. Oh boy, we're having a party. Life's full of mysteries, but that makes it better. So come join the Hardys, we'll solve them together. Oh boy, here come the Hardys. Oh boy, we're having a party. Oh boy, here come the Hardys. Hello, hey, hi, how are you now? You know, we've got so much to do now. A world of adventure is waiting for you here. When we start the action, we're sure that you'll stay near. Oh boy, here come the Hardys. Oh boy, we're having a party. Oh boy!
In this series, the Hardy Boys are members of a rock band that also includes Chubby Morton, a variation of Chet, and completely new characters, Pete Jones and Wanda K. Breckenridge. The band is on a world tour solving mysteries along the way, and ride around in a mod Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. Plenty of era-appropriate psychedelic visuals were included in the musical segments. The Hardy Boys was slated at 11:30, 10:30 a.m. Central against CBS's competing animated mystery series, Scooby-Doo, Where Are You? Episodes were loosely based on titles and story elements from the books. To placate the TV watchdogs, nearly all of the fighting was done off-screen, in silhouette, or in comical fashion. The series was notable for 2 reasons. It featured the first animated black character on U.S. television, Pete Jones, voiced by Filmation regular Dallas McKinnon, who unfortunately was not black. Second, this may have been the first Saturday morning cartoon to have public service announcements, in which the cartoon characters warned about the dangers of things like drug abuse and smoking and encouraged the wearing of your seatbelt. Filmation fans will also note the show was the first use of the Norm Prescott-Lou Scheimer revolving wheel credit. The live band was introduced in the primetime ABC special Super Saturday Cartoon Preview of their new Saturday morning lineup. The special was hosted by the characters of The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, who introduced preview clips of the new shows. For the Hardy Boys segment, the Ghost, Captain Greg, played by Edward Mulhare, appeared on the Muir's TV screen and magically brought the Hardy Boys to life. The band then performed Love and Let Love, each band member performing in front of a life-size picture of their corresponding animated character. The songs performed on the show were a late 60s bubblegum style of music, reminiscent of the Archies, and something we would see again the following year on Hanna-Barbera's Josie and the Pussycats. The live band and music were produced by Chicago's Dunwich Records. Live band members were Reed Kaling as Frank, Jeff Taylor as Joe, Bob Crowder as Pete, Norbert Soltysiak as Chubby, and Devin English as Wanda. A 10-city promotional tour was organized to coincide with the fall premiere of the show. Songs performed on the show were released on the tie-in album Here Come the Hardy Boys, released on record and tape. The following year, the second album, Wheels, was also released. I mentioned that Book 22, The Flickering Torch Mystery, presented the Hardy Boys now in a rock and roll band. That reprint came out in 1971 and it is a distinct possibility the animated series influenced this story element being added to the books. However, the people at the Stratemeyer Syndicate did not sound pleased. Nancy Axelrad, assistant to Harriet Adams, said, "The stories were so action-packed, you couldn't follow them at all. It was not a success." 17 episodes, each containing 2 story segments, were produced, and the show aired up to September 1971. Episodes were directed by Filmation's Hal Sutherland. There does not seem to ever have been a legitimate home video release of this version of the Hardy Boys. But, as is the case with the Disney serials, it was distributed on 16mm film, which are prized by collectors. You can find clips of the show online, but full episodes are often hard to find. I could only locate 3. The Filmation series generated quite a bit of licensed merchandise. A Gold Key 4-issue comic book series, Halloween costumes from Collegeville, a Viewmaster packet, LP records, sheet music, Milton Bradley board game, and a Corgi die-cast toy Silver Ghost Rolls-Royce. Filmation also created a Hardy Boys fan club, where members could join to receive a kit of premiums, a membership card, black and white photos of band members which were also featured on a set of stamps, a newsletter with photos and bios of the band members, and a 45 RPM record of the band members talking about themselves. By 1976, the Hardy Boys books were still strong sellers, moving some 2 million copies per year. Ghost of the Hardy Boys, the autobiography of Leslie McFarlane, was also released this year, spurring newspaper articles which furthered public interest in the history of the book series. In addition, mystery series had become quite popular on network television. Starting in 1971, NBC had offered the NBC Mystery Movie on Sunday nights. This was a wheel series which launched TV detectives McCloud, Columbo, and McMillan and Wife, all rotating to be featured every 3 weeks. This was followed by a Wednesday night mystery movie introducing Banachek, Cool Million, and Madigan. Later entries offered the Snoop Sisters, Tenafly, and Quincy M.E., which introduced the forensic pathology procedural to American television. As you likely know, several of these were broken out into their own series. It was in 1976 that friends Arlene Sidaris and Joyce Brotman were looking for a project to do together. They had been working in the industry as production assistants on various TV movies and variety shows, such as the Glenn Campbell Good Time Hour. Wanting to produce their own television show, the pair were mulling around series concepts when Joyce happened to notice several Nancy Drew cookbooks Arlene had bought as Christmas gifts. Cookbooks? Yes, in 1973, Grosset and Dunlap published this promotional tie-in titled The Nancy Drew Cookbook, Clues to Good Cooking by Carolyn Keene. This triggered Joyce to ask, whatever happened to Nancy Drew? Arlene and Joyce began to think about what would be involved to make a Nancy Drew TV series. Checking into it, they found that Harriet Stratemeyer Adams, then 83, wasn't able to give them the TV rights to Nancy Drew, since these had surprisingly already been licensed out to producer Charles Fries, and they were told a series was already in development. The prolific Fries had a lot going on that year, with several TV movies in production, and the following year would put out 3 series: Saturday Morning Adventure, Thunder, Baby, I'm Back with Demond Wilson, and The Amazing Spider-Man for CBS. However, the TV rights to the Hardy Boys were available. In what later Arlene admitted was a naive move, they licensed the TV rights to the Hardy Boys with their own money and went about shopping the TV series concept to studios. When Paramount didn't bite, In September, they went to Universal, pitching a Butch and Sundance dynamic to Universal producer Glenn Larson. He was interested, and TV partner ABC was on the lookout for something to fill the new early Sunday evening family hour, so they, in turn, were interested. Perhaps someone looked up sales figures and found the Nancy Drew books to outsell the Hardy Boys, as the prospective producers were encouraged to try again to obtain the rights to the Nancy Drew character. Arlene and Joyce went back to Harriet Adams and inexplicably now found the TV rights to Nancy Drew available, although it is unclear just what happened to the Charles Fries series development. However, likely recalling being burned by the Warner deal some 40 years earlier, Adams set forth in the licensing terms that the character be faithfully adapted and retain the classic innocence portrayed in the books. Also, Adams retained script approval for both the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew stories. Glenn Larson, who had been a producer for Universal for nearly a decade on such hits as McCloud, Alias Smith & Jones, The $6 Million Man, and Quincy M.E., was excited to be involved. As he told Den of Geek for a 2010 article on the series, "I happen to have 9 kids, so I wasn't foreign to the idea of something that appealed to a young American." The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries, 1977 to 79, ABC series. The series was first announced to the public in mid-December 1976 as a mid-season replacement for ratings disaster Cause, a sketch variety show hosted by Bill Cosby, taken off the air after 9 outings. The initial title of The Hardy Boys Mystery Hour was used at the time. Casting had taken place in November, 18-year-old Sean Cassidy being the first to be cast. Sean grew up in L.A. and was born into a talented family. His father, Jack Cassidy, had been a performer on Broadway, followed by a career on television. His wife, Shirley Jones, was known for a number of musical film roles, in addition to playing the matriarch of The Partridge Family, the immensely popular ABC series that also happened to feature the talents of Sean's older brother, David. Arlene Sidaris recalled ironically looking for a young David Cassidy for the role of Joe, and they indeed found him. Sean was under contract with Warner Brothers Records at the time, had toured Europe twice, and domestically released several hit singles, featuring the kind of non-threatening teeny bopper-style music parents were comfortable buying for their daughters. Sean's singing ability would be written into the show and character of Joe Hardy, leaning into the concept that was first presented in the 1969 animated series. A full album would follow, coinciding with the end of the first season. The casting of 24-year-old Parker Stevenson came next. He had appeared on TV commercials in a handful of roles and was currently being seen in theaters in the Paramount film Lifeguard, where he came to the attention of Glenn Larson. When he got the call to audition for the Hardy Boys, Stevenson had just graduated from college and was enrolled in NYU to go to business school. As he told Den of Geek in 2010, "I didn't know I was going to be a full-time actor until I made the decision to go and see what would happen with the Hardy Boys. I was glad to have something that moved me out to California to stay for a while." Actor Ed Gilbert was cast as Fenton Hardy, Edith Atwater as Aunt Gertrude. Gary Springer and Lisa Elbacher would be the sometimes seen chums Chet Morton and Callie Shaw, although in this version, Callie is the assistant to Fenton Hardy. As in the books, Fenton was a private detective, following a career on the New York City police force. First-season episodes would depict the college-age Hardy Boys sometimes assisting Fenton with cases, frequently stumbling into their own. And even though their custom 1971 GMC Vandura screams California, the series places the Hardy Boys firmly on the East Coast, in Bayport, Massachusetts. Production began on the initial Hardy Boys episode on January 2nd, with a premiere air date of January 30th. On January 5th, on her 24th birthday, Pamela Sue Martin was signed to portray Nancy Drew. Martin, from Westport, Connecticut, had given up her fast food job for modeling on the recommendation of a friend. She was soon appearing in print ads and TV commercials. When she heard Columbia Pictures was auditioning for a new film, she tried out for the lead role and was cast. Taking time out of her senior year in high school, she filmed To Find a Man, released in 1972.
This friend of mine from school met this guy in Puerto Rico. Now she's going to have a baby. So what we need to do is to find a man.
Well, you can tell your friend that I just don't happen to know where she can find a nice, friendly abortionist.
Although 18 during filming, the press claimed she was 16, possibly based on propaganda put out by the studio to promote the film, which dealt with a teenage girl who becomes pregnant and her search to obtain an abortion. It had a limited syndicated TV run in the 1970s, but for a long time, the film was black-holed by the studio and never released on any form of home video, although it has recently resurfaced and is available on a few digital platforms. This role led to work on Irwin Allen's The Poseidon Adventure, the lead role on Peter Hyam's Our Time from 1974, and a string of TV movies. Nancy Drew producers auditioned Martin, and within 3 weeks, she was filming the first episode. William Schallert as Carson Drew, George O'Hanlon Jr. as Ned Nickerson, and Gene Racy as George Fane would round out the cast. Like the Hardy Boys, Nancy, George, and Ned all appear to be of college age, although exact ages aren't given. It was announced that the characters would alternate, with the Hardy Boys one week, Nancy Drew the next, and every fifth Sunday, both would be given a break for the Brady Bunch Hour, although the Brady substitution only happened twice before being moved to Mondays. The series became known as The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries.
America's classic thrillers come to life. The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries. An adventure into suspense.
There's got to be a way out of here. You used to go with her? Forget that.
Oh, Professor, do ghosts leave footprints?
The adventures of America's favorite young detectives come to television.
Follow that ghost.
The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries.
The opening segment opens on what seems to be a giant maze sitting on a moonlit countryside. The camera zooms in and various book covers from both series are shown, with the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew alternating in partial silhouette, with the impression that they are running through the maze in darkness. The narrator concludes the opening by announcing which series would be shown and the episode title. Early episodes were heavy on the creep factor, several involving supposed hauntings or other supernatural elements, all with a rational Scooby-Doo type cause. Stories then settled into more run-of-the-mill mysteries involving thefts, smuggling, death threats, and blackmail. The first episode, The Mystery of the Haunted House, had the Hardy Boys reluctantly investigate their own father, Fenton Hardy, taking them first to a graveyard, then an all-night haunted house-themed nightclub, all to the chagrin of worrisome Aunt Gertrude. Richard Keel makes an appearance as the cafe manager, accurately made up as Frankenstein's monster in the classic Universal style. In The Mystery of Witch's Hollow, the boys take Chet and Callie in their van to look into the strange goings-on in the woods near the cabin of Callie's uncle. This was the only episode adapted from a Hardy Boys novel, The Clue of the Screeching Owl, first published in 1962, which I believe was the only Hardy Boys book I had. The Disappearing Floor had the Hardy Boys run into a UFO and a mansion full of illusions as part of an investigation into a missing Russian scientist. This shares the title of a 1940 Hardy Boys book, but not much else. The Flickering Torch Mystery also shares a book title, but was completely rewritten. The boys uncover a plot to kill rock star Tony Eagle, but just how will they do it? Ricky Nelson guest stars. Considering the conclusion of the story, it was ironic that Nelson would die 8 years later in a plane crash. The Mystery of the Flying Courier has Joe performing at a nightclub where Frank recognizes a girl that had gone missing 3 years earlier. Dick Gautier appears. In Wipeout, the Hardy Boys are in Hawaii, ostensibly for a surfing competition, but are really undercover to catch a ring of high-end hotel burglars. Deborah Klinger and Lisa Reeves are a pair of female surfing fans that hang out with the boys. The Secret of the Jade Kuan Yin has the boys snorkeling off the coast and finding a crate dumped into the ocean with a jade statue inside that gets them caught up in a smuggling ring. Rosalind Chow, Chinese-Hawaiian character actor Richard Liu, and native Texan Richard Lee Seung, the sex symbol of Chinatown, all guest star. Nancy Drew's first episode, The Mystery of Pirate Cove, had Nancy, Ned Nickerson, and George Fane investigate a supposedly haunted lighthouse. Monty Markham guest stars. This was filmed on location at the Yaquina Head Lighthouse in Newport, Oregon. Upon the film crew leaving, the Coast Guard was not happy with the condition the lighthouse was left in. As part of dressing the location for filming, the interior was covered in dust and cobwebs, which was a plot point in the story. The lighthouse lenses had also been painted over, and none of this was cleaned up when the production left. The Coast Guard spent 2.5 days cleaning up the lighthouse, inside quarters, and windows. 1,500 gallons of water was reportedly used to flush out the dirt and fake cobwebs left behind. In The Mystery of the Diamond Triangle, Nancy sees a car run off the road from her glider, but after they land, she and George find a closed road, a broken-down bridge, and no trace of a collision. The Secret of the Whispering Walls has Nancy Drew investigate her aunt's attempt to sell their farm, as events occur that lead them to believe it is haunted. Some plot elements here come from the books The Hidden Staircase and The Secret of Red Gate Farm. This was the only Nancy Drew episode to take plot elements from the books. A Haunting We Will Go had Nancy acting in a benefit stage play managed by Ned, a revival of a play performed 20 years ago at the same theater. 5 of the original actors returned for the performance, but strange occurrences plagued the production. Carl Betts, Victor Buono, Bob Crane, Dina Merrill, and Pippa Scott are the representatives of Old Hollywood, and this was the second to the last appearances for Betts and Crane, who both died the following year. In The Mystery of the Fallen Angels, Nancy and friends investigate a traveling carnival in the wake of a jewel heist, which features genre favorites Beverly Garland, A. Martinez, Jamie Lee Curtis, and Robert Englund. Craig Littler, who would be Jason of Star Command the following year, also appears. Then Nancy and George go on vacation, but are sucked into a mystery when a famous mystery writer receives a series of death threats straight out of his own novels in The Mystery of the Ghost Writer's Cruise. Establishing shots of the cruise ship at the very beginning of the episode were clearly of the Pacific Princess from ABC's The Love Boat, before the story took place on a completely different ship. The plot also contains a sequence in which the instruments report a tidal wave is approaching the ship, a reference to the Poseidon adventure, which also featured Pamela Sue Martin. Here, the character of George Fane got a makeover. In the previous 5 episodes, she was depicted as sort of a dowdy nerd and something of a scaredy cat. But here, she clearly has been to the beauty salon and is more confident, immediately being hit on by the ship's entertainment director. This new personality carried over to the next Nancy Drew outing, The Mystery of the Solid Gold Kicker, where the Drew crew stumble into a blackmail scheme attempt to fix a college football game. Mark Harmon, Terry Kaiser, Martin Cove, and Howard Cosell all appear. However, from here, both Gene Ramsay and George O'Hanlon Jr. were dropped from the series, and new actors showed up as George and Ned in future episodes. For Season 2, the opening segment is changed. The maze is done away with, and the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew get their own specific openings. In each, a grid of 72 book covers fill the screen, half Hardy Boys and half Nancy Drew, before these blink out to show select books with larger covers from the appropriate series, interspersed with scenes from various episodes. New artwork is seen on the book covers, reflecting the likenesses of the lead actors. Unlike Season 1, as soon as the first grid of books blinked out, and either Frank and Joe or Nancy showed up on the screen, you knew who was going to be featured and didn't have to wait for the narrator to tell you. 22 books in all were featured on the Hardy Boys Nancy Drew opening for Season 2, dating from 1939 to 1976, the last book printed prior to series production. The Hardy Boys not only meet Nancy Drew, but they also meet Dracula in the memorable two-part season opener, when an international art theft case brings Fenton Hardy to Transylvania. He goes missing. 2 weeks later, Frank and Joe follow leads across Europe, leading them to collide with Nancy Drew, also looking for Fenton Hardy. The investigation leads them to a rock festival at Dracula's castle, hosted by Paul Williams. They also encounter a Romanian inspector played by Lorne Greene. Although you would think they would have saved this one to air closer to Halloween, the decision was made to air it as the season premiere in early September. This marks the first time the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew have a crossover story. This did not happen in the books until 1988. Unlike previous episodes, at least some second unit footage was filmed in Paris, Munich, and the German countryside. However, this had to have been stock footage, possibly mixed with scenes shot for another film, featuring a VW bus driving through Munich. Several online sources claim Romania's Ponari Castle, the real Romanian mountain fortress claimed by Vlad the Impaler, is seen in establishing shots of Dracula's castle in the episodes. However, modern ruins of Ponari Castle do not resemble at all the two establishing shots used. After looking at numerous European castles, I finally matched it to Hohenwerfen Castle in Austria. Nestled in the Berchtesgaden Alps near the German border, Hohenwerfen overlooks the Austrian market town of Werfen and has changed little since the 16th century. However, its origins begin 500 years earlier, when it was constructed at the command of Archbishop Gebhard of Salzburg, beginning in 1075 CE, during a major conflict between church and state. The castle was extended in the 12th century and again in the 16th, after it was damaged in the German Peasants' War. The main building was then nearly completely destroyed by fire in 1931, then restored. Over the centuries, it has been used as a state prison, a Nazi education camp, and a training location for the Austrian gendarmerie. It was most famously used as a filming location for Where Eagles Dare from 1968, and was also seen in the background in the Do-Re-Mi picnic scene of The Sound of Music, filmed at Schwantonga-Weissen. Today, it is a tourist attraction that can be visited from the late spring to mid-fall and hosts special events such as medieval festivals and falconry shows.
Roll on thunder, shine on lightning, the days are long and the nights so frightening. Nothing matters anyway, and that's the hell of it.
The first song performed by Paul Williams in this episode, The Hell of It, is also performed by him in Phantom of the Paradise from 1974. Williams also seems to begin humming the opening bars of the Bonanza theme when Lorne Greene walks by. A novelization of these episodes was released the following year by Hardy Boys publisher Grosset and Dunlap. From here, the Hardy Boys seemed to go on the road, with episodes set in Egypt to break up an antiquity smuggling ring, Kenya to investigate poaching, New Mexico to look into UFO sightings, an airliner that crashes in the Bermuda Triangle, Vegas, Acapulco, New Orleans, Austria, Hawaii, Budapest, and ironically, right at Universal Studios. For that one, they didn't even have to hide the fact that they were on the backlot. The mystery of King Tut's tomb took advantage of current Tut mania, with the Hardy Boys becoming enmeshed in an Egyptian antiquities smuggling ring in Cairo. Cesar Danova, Jeff David, and Taryn Power guest star. The mystery of the African safari has the Hardy Boys on the hunt for an illegal poacher stalking a Kenyan nature preserve. Ann Lockhart and Percy Rodriguez guest star. The Creatures Who Came on Sunday has the boys again coming up against supposed UFOs, this time in New Mexico, concealing a government operation to hide away high-profile witnesses and defectors while they change their identities. John Quaid and Tony Dow guest star. In The Strange Fate of Flight 608, the boys are on an airliner full of stewardesses that crashes in the Bermuda Triangle, resulting from an act of sabotage to conceal a diamond smuggling operation. Footage from Universal 1970 TV movie The Lost Flight is shown for added production value, which is why you see so many men on the escape rafts, when the three pilots and the Hardy Boys were supposed to be the only men on the plane. In Acapulco Spies, the boys are called by a distraught Fenton Hardy, needing them to bring a locked box of files to Acapulco. But when they get there, they find he is being held prisoner by an ex-spy, an old friend of Fenton's. Craig Stevens, Deborah Ryan, and Kimberly Beck guest star. The Mystery of the Silent Scream has the boys in Las Vegas, where a deaf woman claims to have overheard a plot to blow up casinos on the Strip via lip reading. Martha Garrett, Elizabeth Stack, Larry Storch, and singer Trini Lopez guest star. In Oh Say Can You Sing, a 4th of July trip to a small town for Joe to sing at a friend's concert leads to investigating a hit-and-run accident. Guy Stockwell and Deborah Klinger, who returns as a new character, guest stars. Klinger was also known as Super Chick from The Croft Super Show. In The House on Possessed Hill, Joe hides out in a creepy old house with a young psychic woman who is on the run from townsfolk. Melanie Griffith and Royal Dano guest star. This episode shares elements with the book The House on the Cliff. The famous Universal Psycho house is seen again. Joe actually asks Frank, "I wonder if Hitchcock's seen this place." Also, a propped manuscript is seen that was later used on Voyager's episode The Trial of Phineas Bogg, where there it was a page of young Jeffrey's future accomplishments written in the Voyager language. Soul Survivor had Joe wake up in Hong Kong after being in a coma for almost a year to be told that Frank and Fenton Hardy had been killed months earlier. Of course, it was a ruse designed to obtain information from Joe about a scientist defecting to the West. Diana Muldaur, James Hong, and Jean-Marie Han from Arc 2 all guest star. As Glenn Larson Productions was known to do, this script was later rewritten and reused for the Airwolf 1984 episode Echoes from the Past. I'll also note a very similar plot used 5 months later in a 1984 V The Series episode. All have their origin in the 1965 film 36 Hours with James Garner and Eva Marie Saint. The plot also showed up at least 7 times on Mission Impossible, as well as on The $6 Million Man, Star Trek The Next Generation, and Enterprise, as well as many other TV shows. Fake news reports created for Joe's benefit included mention of a surprise wedding between Prince Charles and Princess Caroline of Monaco. At the time, it was widely rumored that they were in a secret relationship and would eventually marry. Of course, this did not happen, and Charles married Lady Diana in July 1981. The second newscast mentioned the fall of Uganda's Idi Amin, which in reality did happen a few months later than predicted. In the Airwolf episode 6 years later, the first report was changed to the divorce of Charles and Diana in July 1984. This predated their real-life divorce some 12 years later. In Death Surf, the Hardy Boys are again in Hawaii, and while windsurfing, the girl nearest Frank falls into the ocean and apparently drowns. As they look into the girl, Mary Ann, Frank's interest begins to border on obsession. Jack Jones and Maren Jensen guest star. In Campus Terror, the boys investigate a maniacal stalker who is abducting female students at Westlake College and name drops Frank and Joe during a threatening phone call. However, the stalker has a shocking identity. Valerie Bertinelli, Jack Ging, and Stephanie Kramer guest star. Parts of this episode were shot on the Rampart Hospital sets of Emergency. And the maintenance console for the old IBM AN FSQ-7 shows up as the mainframe college computer. Once used as part of the computerized Air Defense Command and Control System in the 1950s. By the 70s, it was relegated to movie prop. The Q-7 is still seen as a computer prop on TV and film. Nancy Drew drew the short end of the stick in Season 2, with only 3 standalone episodes, while her remaining 4 appearances were crossover episodes also featuring the Hardy Boys. The first one, the 2-parter, The Mystery of the Hollywood Phantom, have the boys run into Nancy at LAX, in town for the detective convention, conveniently right near Universal Studios, where they run into Casey Kasem, cosplaying as Columbo, Dennis Weaver filming McCloud, Jacqueline Smith filming Charlie's Angels, and Robert Wagner filming Switch. Other shows that later did the detective convention bit were The Rockford Files in 1979 and Vegas in 1980. Nancy Drew's love match took Nancy and George to an exclusive tennis tournament after running into an old classmate who is now a kleptomaniac. But is she responsible for the string of jewel heists going on? Here, Nancy crashes her little Ford Mustang II Ghia, which promptly catches on fire and is not seen again on the series. This episode introduced Susan Buckner as George Fane and featured TV favorites Maureen McCormick, Roger C. Carmel, and Jack Colvin. Will the Real Santa Claus borrowed heavily from Miracle on 34th Street. Here, Rick Springfield makes his sole appearance as Ned Nickerson, and his introduction was somewhat bizarre as he is brought in as a completely new character with a different backstory. There was also something of a Star Trek reunion here, with William Shallard as Carson Drew, guest star William Campbell, and director Michael Pataki, as all had appeared on fan-favorite episode The Trouble with Tribbles in 1967. Child actors Sparky Marcus and Missy Gold also appear. The Lady on Thursday at 10 had Nancy stumble into an assassination plot in New York City. Nicholas Hammond and Simon Oakland guest star, but this was both the final solo episode for Nancy Drew and the final outing for Pamela Sue Martin as the character is recast. Season 2 team-ups. In the two-parter Voodoo Doll, the Hardy Boys run into one problem after another in New Orleans for Mardi Gras, where they find Nancy Drew already working the case, posing as a magician in a voodoo-themed nightclub. Ray Milland, Kim Cattrall, Linda Dano, James T. Callahan, and appropriately Julius Harris, familiar to audiences as Teehee from Live and Let Die, all guest star in these lackluster episodes. This was the first appearance of Janet Louise Johnson as Nancy Drew, as she takes over the role in the character's remaining 2 outings. In Mystery on the Avalanche Express, Frank, Joe, Nancy Drew, and George all board the same train to an Austrian ski lodge, but find that a strange woman on the run has switched bags with Nancy. In a bit of stunt casting, 60s idols Ed Kooky Burns, Troy Donahue, Tommy Sands, and Fabian all guest star. The kids watching didn't know who they were, but their parents did. In Arson and Old Lace, a distraught Carson Drew meets with the Hardys after Nancy Drew had been missing for 6 months. Finding she has been held captive in the penthouse of a mentally ill former movie star, a girl seeking revenge sets fire to the building she is in, creating a deadly situation. Solving the case puts the boys on the radar of a federal agent, with implications for the following season. Joseph Cotton, Kathy Rigby, and Pernell Roberts guest star. Footage and audio from Emergency were used. This marked the final appearance of the Nancy Drew character, as the following season would focus solely on the Hardy Boys. The Hardy Boys returned for Season 3 with a vastly different take on the theme song and story dynamic. Gone is the mysterious, curious theme, replaced with a brash, fast-paced version emphasizing action, credited exclusively to Glenn Larson, who, if you weren't aware, had a musical background and composed music for 3 gold records before he ever became a TV producer. Frank and Joe are also seen in solid color action silhouette a la Charlie's Angels. In the 2-part season opener, The Last Kiss of Summer, Joe has spent time on the West Coast with Jamie, who he asks to marry him. But following a near head-on collision, Jamie is killed. Joe finds out the driver is Jocko, a wanted criminal for several years. Repressing his feelings, Joe gains Jocko's trust and runs his own op to bring him to justice, initially interfering with the feds before they join his effort. Ann Lockhart, Jack Kelly, Kevin Tighe, Christy Welsh, and Kevin Brophy guest star, who of course was Lucan, currently airing on ABC. Yes, Joe has his James Bond moment as the Hardy Boys do their take on Her Majesty's Secret Service, the 1969 film where Bond married, only to have wife Teresa killed at the end of the film.
If a picture paints 1,000 words, then why can't I paint you?
If by Bread is prominently heard during scenes with Joe and Jamie and is used as a musical through line throughout both episodes. From here, Fenton Hardy works for the Justice Department, and federal agent Harry Hammond recruits Frank and Joe to be federal operatives. I think we're meant to assume he was the agent the boys worked with in Arson and Old Lace, even though he went by a different name. Assault on the Tower takes the boys to London in search of their missing father, where they get enmeshed in a jewel heist and make contact with a certain distinguished English gentleman in a bowler hat identified only as S. Leon Ames, Dana Andrews, Pernell Roberts, and Patrick McNee guest star. And yes, the insinuation is that S was John Steed from The Avengers. By this time, viewers were hearing McNee narrate the opening to Battlestar Galactica, airing right after the Hardy Boys.
There are those who believe that life here began out there, far across the universe.
On Galactica, he also provided the voice of the Imperious Leader, and would be seen as the evil Count Eblee in the January 14th episode, War of the Gods, that aired right after what would be the final episode of the Hardy Boys. Search for Atlantis has the boys pose as students at an archaeology dig in Greece that is plagued with accidents as they investigate a drug smuggling operation. Darlene Carr, Lloyd Nolan, and John Colicos guest star. The Los Angeles Federal Building is shown here in an establishing shot as the Washington, D.C. Federal Building, where the Hardy Boys get their assignments from Harry Hammond. Dangerous Waters has the Justice Department send the Hardy Boys on vacation to the Caribbean to find a missing young woman who was searching for buried treasure. Rebecca York, Dane Clark, Robert Loggia, and June Lockhart guest star. The establishing shot in this episode now has the Thurgood Marshall United States Courthouse in Manhattan stand in for the Federal Building where Frank and Joe get their assignments. In Scorpion's Sting, the Hardy Boys are sent to Puerto Rico. Joe protects a senator's daughter while Frank goes undercover to turn the daughter of the international blackmailer known as the Scorpion. Craig Stevens, Joseph Ruskin, and Robin Matson guest star. The alternate title of The Abductor was given by some TV listings. Following this episode, ABC cancels The Hardy Boys, citing poor ratings, especially from this latest episode that scored a 12.3 rating and a 19 share, combined with the fact that the episode was the lead-in for blockbuster ABC Sunday night movie, The Sting, which was the #1 viewed program of the week. The following week, the show was preempted for a Pat Boone Thanksgiving special, and the remaining 4 episodes would be burned off on Sunday evenings up to January 14th. In the 2-part Defection to Paradise, the daughter of a Russian general is smuggled out of Russia in a speaker equipment case belonging to popular U.S. band Bread following a concert. When they land in Hawaii, the band manager calls Harry at the Justice Department, getting Frank and Joe involved in what ostensibly is a case of theft, but turns out to be far more when the KGB comes looking for the girl. Nehemiah Persoff, Pamela Franklin, and David Gates, Larry Knechtel, and Michael Botts of Bread all guest star.
I found your diary underneath the tree and started reading about me.
Diary by Bread is not only heard at the very beginning of Part 1, but David Gates is seen in concert performing nearly the entire song. Gates then launches into Goodbye Girl as the episode plot kicks off. Took the Last Train, Make It With You, The Guitar Man, and a portion of Everything I Own are also heard. An easy listening cover of the Bee Gees' How Deep Is Your Love is also heard. This episode really took me back to the mid-70s and hearing the LP The Best of Bread being played in the living room. In Game Plan, Frank goes undercover in Atlantic City to take down a securities racket, but a mole in the department may throw a wrench in the op. Mary Louise Weller, Nancy Morgan, and Jim Raymond guest star. Atlantic City had only recently legalized gambling casinos 2 years prior to this episode. Life on the line. While on assignment to protect a female motocross racer, the daughter of a mob informant, another young woman becomes obsessed with Frank. Karen Lamb, Ben Hammer, Adam Rourke, and a pre-Falcon Crest Anna Alicia guest star. It was as if everyone was going through the motions here, and Lamb and Alicia in particular give the most awful performances of the series. And after 46 episodes, the series comes to an end, with this final, exceedingly disappointing installment airing January 14th, 1979.
Lasers ready.
The Battle of Galactica has begun. Where are the humans?
They are on the Universal Studios tour at the collapsing bridge and suspect nothing.
We will capture them.
In the doomed glacier expedition.
We will torture them.
At the shack.
We will annihilate them.
They are here.
The Battle of Galactica has begun. At the Universal Studios tour.
Behind the scenes. The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries was a co-production of Glenn A. Larson and Universal Television. Arlene Sidaris and Joyce Brotman, who you'll recall licensed the rights to the characters from the Stratemeyer Syndicate, were given co-producer roles on the series, and their credit was alternated, with Sidaris given top credit one week and Brotman the next. The pair had been longtime fans of Nancy Drew in particular, as Sidaris noted in a period UPI interview. "We grew up on Nancy Drew. It was probably my first reading. Nancy Drew just brought back memories of this terrific girl who got into all these wonderfully exciting situations and fought herself out of them. There was also the matter of women's role models, but that really came up later. Our first thought was nostalgia." Early on, it became clear that the Hardy Boys' casting choices were right on target, as Joyce Brotman recalled to Den of Geek in 2010. "When we saw Parker with Sean, we knew right away that was the combination that was going to work for us." Recurring guest star Anne Lockhart added, "The two of them were opposites but balanced each other so well. Parker was an Eastern, preppy kind of guy, and Sean was the Southern California kid." Sean Cassidy had been encouraged to audition for acting roles by Ruth Ahrens, the talent manager that worked with his family, as he told Entertainment Weekly last year. Ruth said, "Why don't you go on some acting auditions? It might be nice to see if you can walk and talk at the same time, should this singing thing take off. I'd done a little acting in school, and I'd made a couple little independent films. My second audition was The Hardy Boys. I had seen a casting breakdown in Ruth's office, and I remember saying to her, I think I could do this. I knew it was at Universal, and I knew it was a mystery show. And Glenn Larson, the EP, had worked with my dad, so I knew him a little bit. So I just felt there was something in this for me. I screen tested, and then finally with Parker, got the job." Interestingly, in his autobiography, Sean's older brother, David, recalled Ahrens encouraging him to do the Hardy Boys and turning it down. It was not clear if he auditioned for the role or not. Tragically, Sean's 49-year-old father, Jack Cassidy, star of musicals, movies, television, stage, and cabaret for 3 decades, died in an apartment fire shortly after Sean's casting. The fire was ruled to have likely been caused by a smoldering cigarette that dropped from his hand after falling asleep on the couch in his West Hollywood penthouse. Prior to his death, the press reported that he was very happy and proud for his son for landing a lead role in a series. Following the first season, Sean reflected on his father's death for People magazine. "There are so many things I'd like to ask him. He could really blow away people who didn't know him very well. But I never doubted his love. He was a real father. My regret is that he died before he saw me on TV or heard my album." As far as Chet, Iola, and the other Hardy Boys chums, they never made it as regulars in the series, although Chet was seen twice in early episodes before the character was dropped. When it came to Nancy Drew, Joyce Brotman related that she took longer to cast, with the role finally being given to Pamela Sue Martin. "Everybody had a fixed image in their heads, so everyone that came in, no, she's not tall enough. She's Too Blonde, She's Too Red. But when we found Pamela, everyone was happy. Instead of a full pilot for the Hardy Boys, Larson was asked to put together a one-day presentation reel for ABC. These were also sometimes called pitch reels or sizzle reels. Instead of an episode-length story, a short film reel would consist of a few key scenes that captured the character dynamics, visuals, and core concepts of the series. Parker Stevenson said, "Glenn took that literally, and he shot 24 hours. Larson recalled, "I couldn't figure out what I would show the networks. We started at around 8 or 9 in the morning, and we shot 23 7/10 hours straight, which was a studio record." With the co-stars having just met each other, Stevenson said, "In those 24 hours, I really got to know Sean." A third of the footage shot for the presentation reel reportedly ended up in the first episode, The Mystery of the Haunted House. The inquisitive theme song used in the opening segments of the first 2 seasons was composed by Universal regular Stu Phillips. Phillips had worked with Glenn Larson when he was at Capitol Records, where he produced a session with Larson's group, The Four Preps. The song was a letter to the Beatles, a parody of 60s Beatlemania. In post-production, Larson was present during the dub-down and annoyed Phillips to the point where he asked Larson to leave. Upon release, the Beatles were not happy, and their attorneys demanded Capitol recall the Four Preps record. Capitol acquiesced to the demand, lest their relationship with the supergroup be threatened. 9 years later, Phillips got a call from Larson, asking if he'd like to compose for the pilot of a new series he was producing that would be called The $6 Million Man. Gil Malay was contracted to score the initial pilot film, but when a second pilot film was approved, Wine, Women, and War, Phillips scored the music. Note that Phillips did not compose the intro song, composed by Larson and sung by Dusty Springfield, nor did he do the familiar series theme we all remember. That was Oliver Nelson. However, this did lead to more work with Larson and Universal Television. Switch, McCloud, and Quincy M.E. were 3 shows Phillips worked on prior to Hardy Boys Nancy Drew. In his 2003 book, Stew Who, Phillips recalls riding in Larson's Porsche discussing business when Larson was needed on the set of The Hardy Boys shooting at the Burbank airport. During the 5-mile drive, Phillips white-knuckled it as Larson zipped up Cahuenga Boulevard from Universal to the airport in record time. Following Hardy Boys Nancy Drew, Stu Phillips composed themes for Battlestar Galactica, Buck Rogers in the 25th Century, Knight Rider, The Fall Guy, and The Highwayman. Like Voyagers, just considered on Forgotten TV, ABC was interested in the Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries for the 7/6 Central Sunday evening time slot. This was a time slot newly available to the 3 TV networks under the control of FCC guidelines, which required either news-based or family entertainment with at least ostensibly educational value to be broadcast there. This was a revision to the previously established Prime Time Access Rule, or PTAR, first implemented in the fall of 1971 and more thoroughly discussed in the podcast on The Immortal, since it at least partially led to the demise of that series. Previously, ABC had slotted The Swiss Family Robinson here during the 1975-76 season, while CBS had family adventure drama 3 for the Road, featuring the Karras family traveling the West Coast full-time in their RV. NBC offered their reliable Sunday evening program, The Wonderful World of Disney. However, this time slot often became fraught with problems for series placed here. Although a quality program and the first drama produced by MTM Enterprises, 40 CBS affiliates opted not to carry 3 for the road in favor of their own news-based programs. After a half season, it was pulled, with CBS moving its own news program, 60 Minutes, into the time slot. This move hurt the Irwin Allen-produced Swiss Family Robinson that not only had to now go up against 2 strong competitors, but also was constrained by time slot guidelines as to what could be depicted in the drama that was supposed to show a family fighting for survival, marooned on a harsh, remote island. As actress Pat Delaney explained at the time, "We can't show blood or bullets or see impact, and we mustn't depict violence between animals. We can't go off and kill monkeys in the wild as in the book, and we're not allowed to depict the real danger in a covered pit awaiting my children in the jungle." This combination of factors hurt the ratings for Swiss Family, which was canceled after a single season. For the 1976-77 season, ABC offered Cause, a sketch comedy variety program featuring an ensemble cast headed by America's then favorite, Bill Cosby. But Cause clearly wasn't cutting it against 60 Minutes and Disney either, so ABC was looking for something to replace the struggling series. As Arlene Sidaris noted to Den of Geek, NBC had the Disney movie, CBS had 60 Minutes, and ABC was looking for something, so we were perfect for that time slot. ABC's decision to slot Hardy Boys Nancy Drew on early Sunday evenings turned out to be a good one, though this certainly wasn't guaranteed, given the competition, particularly against 60 Minutes, which became a Sunday evening ratings powerhouse for CBS, dominating the time slot for years, and not just due to older viewers, as Arlene Sidaris explained to Forgotten TV. Capturing ratings was a challenge, since 60 Minutes was required watching for many high school students. We did well enough that for the first time, the books were carried in public school libraries. Sales of the books soared, and merchandise was created. Indeed, period newspaper articles document the scramble some school libraries experienced, attempting to add Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew books to their shelves due to heavy demand in the wake of the popularity of the series. Carolyn Bristow, Director of Library Services for the school district in Troy, Ohio, confirmed in April 1977. A few years ago, no self-respecting libraries would have given shelf room to serial books such as the Hardy Boys. We do now, though, because there's a demand. And we'll circle back around to that merchandise. When the first season was being planned out, it was quickly determined that in most instances, attempting to use plots directly from the books would be problematic and difficult to adapt into a 1-hour format. Thus, nearly all storylines were completely original scripts, cranked out by Larson and the writing team, which included Michael Sloan, known for Harry O., McCloud, and Battlestar Galactica, Christopher Crowe, known for Beretta and BJ and the Bear, Lou Shaw, creative force behind Get Christy Love and Quincy M.E., and Steven D'Souza, then of Gemini Man, $6 Million Man, and The Bionic Woman, among other series. Recall that first season episodes were shot unusually close to air dates, no more than 2 or 3 weeks ahead. This led to very long days of shooting, sometimes working 18-hour days. On Fridays, the shooting would run even later. As revealed in last year's EW article, there were constant issues with show production. Parker Stevenson. An episode was supposed to be shot in 7 or 8 days, and often it would be 12 or 14 days to shoot it, because we didn't have the script. The pages hadn't come in, so we'd be sitting around, or the pages would come in, and then we'd all look at them and go, well, this doesn't make sense. It was kind of patched together from some other ideas that somebody had, and then they'd can those pages, and 4 days later we'd get the scene to shoot all over again. Or they'd jump to another episode because the episode we were shooting wasn't quite finished in the writing. So that was the frustration. It's also why the hours were so long, because it took forever sorting out scenes.
Sean Cassidy added,
The writing staff was doing all they could do, and Glenn had like 10 shows on the air. It was not running like a well-oiled machine, let's put it that way. So we would be in the middle of the scene, and new pages would come down that would be very different. The other thing that used to happen, we were shooting scripts that had not really been thought through. Then with ADR, they'd cut to the shrubbery, and we'd explain the plot, like, the jewels are buried in the thing.
Like earlier TV incarnations, this series was largely a product of its time, and not a strict interpretation of the books. Frank and Joe were older, wore bell-bottoms, and had feathered 70s hair. While the Nielsen ratings of the first season were acceptable given the competition, a renewal wasn't guaranteed and could have gone either way. This would be typical throughout the entirety of the series, as Parker Stevenson recalled to EW.
I don't think the show ever got picked up more than 6 episodes at a time. We never had a full season pickup. It was always on the bubble, as they say.
Additionally, Arlene Sidaris revealed the Season 1 finale, directed by her husband, happening to coincide on a very particular night, telling Forgotten TV,
The first season's final episode aired the evening of the ABC programmers' meeting. Directed by Andy Sidaris, the episode was Mystery of the Solid Gold Kicker. The strong rating resulted in the season renewal of the series.
While Season 1 presented investigations from an entirely skeptical perspective in keeping with the books, in Season 2 we saw a shift toward stories seemingly incorporating supernatural elements. When asking Arlene Sidaris about this shift, she acknowledged this story direction originated with producer Glenn Larson. The supernatural story beats were usually witnessed only by Joe, Inspector Stavlin having no image in the mirror in The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew Meet Dracula, the ghostly figure coming out of the haunted house in House on Possessed Hill, Mr. Dove insinuated as having turned into a snake at the end of Voodoo Doll. As stories shifted to incorporate more horror-influenced themes, Universal's licensed properties and backlot locations could be worked into them. For example, the depiction of Frankenstein's monster in the Universal style is seen more than once and incorporated into the Season 2 opening. The famous Psycho House was seen in the debut episode, as well as Season 2's The House on Possessed Hill, itself a nail-biter, where the house is presented much of a character in itself. And of course, in a meta moment, we had the 2-parter set right at Universal Studios. The fact that the show was produced by Universal and filmed largely on the backlot meant the production was constantly surrounded by film history. The Hardy Boys house was located on the famed Colonial Street, home to Leave It to Beaver, The Munsters, Marcus Welby, and other productions. The Hardy's house is known as Building 4, Johnson Home, on the lot, and was later seen on The Burbs, The New Lassie, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Deep Impact, and of course, Desperate Housewives. The Nancy Drew house was Building 11 and was newly constructed for the series. It also was later seen on The Burbs and Desperate Housewives. If you watch closely, many other backlot locations can be spotted. Jaws Lake, Laramie Street, the Psycho House, and the Universal Apartments north of Park Lake were some of the locations used. The on-property Sheraton Universal Hotel was also often seen. Asked by EW about life on the studio lot, Parker Stevenson recalled going to lunch and sitting next to Alfred Hitchcock at the commissary. Sean Cassidy added,
We were the babies on the lot. My first day, I think I was late and panicked and couldn't find where I was supposed to park. I saw this space that had the name Billy Wilder on it, and I thought
That was a kid, so I parked in that space. Idiot me didn't know who Billy Wilder was yet. I was quickly read the riot act by Scotty, who was the legendary gatekeeper, literally the gatekeeper at Universal. That is Mr. Wilder's space. You will never park there again. I remember bumping into Lee Major's limousine once with my car. That was awkward. Ironically, even though Nancy Drew outsold the Hardy Boys as far as books were concerned, on the TV series, it was the Hardy Boys that proved more popular, driven mainly by the popularity of Shaun Cassidy, then emerging as a pop music star. The focus on having quite a number of episodes incorporate his musical performances even threatened to overshadow the stories presented. This led to a running gag that whenever Joe performed, Frank would be off investigating the case. By the 9th episode, it was clear the show was becoming a promotional vehicle for Shaun Cassidy, with his single The Do Run Run timed to release the same weekend, and self-titled debut album releasing the week after the last episode of the first season. Shaun explained to EW how the combination of performing and acting consumed his life during show production. From 18 to 21, I was doing the show during the week, and on Friday nights, a car would come and take me directly to an airport. My band would be there. We'd fly out to a city, do a concert Saturday and Sunday night, and be back for work Monday morning, which explains why in many episodes I have big dark circles under my eyes. Warner Brothers, who I had a deal with, when they found out I was doing a television show in the States, they were like, well, we're finishing an album, and we're going to get it out in concert with the show coming on. Both things kind of blew up at the same time. By the summer of 1977, he was appearing on the covers of Tiger Beat, Teen Bag, and other magazines. Shaun Cassidy merchandise such as posters and pennants that said, "I love Shaun," had already hit stores, ahead of official Hardy Boys licensed merchandise. Still, Shaun seemed down to earth and circumspect about his fame, likely not only due to the grounding influence of his mother, Shirley Jones, but also given what had happened at a concert given by older brother David in 1974. David was on the final leg of a world tour and giving a concert at White City Stadium in Shepherd's Bush, London. But there was additional mania as a burned-out Cassidy had announced he was quitting the biz on the tail end of a 4-year whirlwind of fame, driven by ABC hit The Partridge Family. The 35,000-capacity sports arena had, of course, been sold out for weeks, but the area had been swamped with crowds all day, as ticketless hopefuls, scalpers, and ticket holders excited for the concert converged. By the time the concert started, many had been on their feet for 12 hours, including 14-year-old Bernadette Whelan. When the crowd was finally admitted into the stadium, the masses of people damaged the entrance doors, bending them inward. After the opening act ended and Cassidy took the stage, the screaming crowd pushed forward toward a 4-foot barrier. Someone stumbled, and 1,000 attendees fell with them. Though many were injured, young Bernadette suffered the worst, as the crushing crowd prevented her from breathing. Unconscious, her body was picked up and crowd-surfed to paramedics who attempted to revive her. Around 30 others were injured seriously enough to be hospitalized. Incredibly, the concert resumed, as Cassidy had no comprehension of the seriousness of what had just happened. Taken to hospital, Bernadette was placed on life support. 4 days later, she died. David Cassidy was shocked when he initially heard the extent of what happened and wanted to cancel the final 2 performances. However, those shows also went on, although a significant number of parents returned their kids' tickets and kept them home. It had been arranged that the White City Stadium show would be recorded for a live album. It was indeed released on LP as Cassidy Live. David Cassidy commented on the release decades later in his autobiography. The Cassidy Live album was recorded at the White City Stadium show, and it was done on the fly. The most difficult part was keeping the screaming and shouting from the audience out of the recordings. We had to edit out all the times I was saying, push back, people are getting crushed. That album depicts the madness of touring. 3 years after the event, Sean Cassidy reflected on the tragedy to People magazine. I don't remember much about David's early career, but we've talked about what happened to him. If I let things get out of hand, I have no one to blame but myself. I know I have the power to whip audiences into a frenzy, but I never will. It's sick. Still, there's no denying the popularity Sean and Parker experienced as the Hardy Boys. This occasionally caused issues, as Ann Lockhart recalled being driven back to the hotel following a day of shooting in San Diego. We pulled up to the hotel, and there were 100 girls there screaming. Parker and Sean were like, "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" I told the driver, "Keep going." We sped through the front entrance of the hotel, and there was a side door. All these girls took off running after the car. We all jumped out and ran into the hotel. I held the door closed with all my strength, heels dug into the ground, with 100 girls on the other side trying to pry it open. I'm screaming over my shoulder, "Run, you guys, run!" And I was able to give them a 30-second head start to get to their rooms before the door opened up and the girls ran past me. The producers attempted to resolve the issue of uneven popularity by merging Nancy Drew into Hardy Boys episodes with team-ups in the second season. This previously had been specifically forbidden by Harriet Adams, owner of the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew characters, as Arlene Sidaris explained to Forgotten TV. The original license that Joyce and I obtained specifically restricted combining the characters. Joyce and I met with Mrs. Adams in New Jersey and convinced her, under her terms, to allow the characters to meet. No kissing. Instead, a mild romantic attraction was implied between Frank Hardy and Nancy Drew. Still, a brief, chaste kiss was shared at the conclusion of two-parter The Mystery of the Hollywood Phantom. At least until they were interrupted by Joe.
What I'd like to do is thank you.
For what?
For saving my life. Thank you.
Hi there. Well, where are we off to?
The unfortunate effect of the combined episodes resulted in Nancy Drew being overshadowed by the Hardy Boys, to the displeasure of the actress portraying her. When it became clear Nancy Drew was not going to have an equal every other week presence in the second season, given only 3 standalone outings, Pamela Sue Martin began publicly voicing her opinion. ABC and Universal offered her an increased salary from $10,000 to $15,000 per episode to encourage her to stay on. But at mid-season, when it was clear that ABC was not ordering any more standalone Nancy Drews, Martin started to want out of the series. Producer Michael Sloan commented at the time, "We've got 8 more shows to do to fill out the remainder of the season, and the situation has not been resolved. We're still talking back and forth with Pamela and hope the problem will be worked out." But it wasn't worked out, and the role of Nancy Drew was recast. As ABC's Fred Silverman said, "She wasn't happy, and there's no point in having an unhappy person around." 18-year-old Janet Louise Johnson was cast, whose only prior TV work were on episodes of Alias Smith and Jones and The Waltons when she was 13 and 14 years old. The recasting was announced to the public toward the end of January 1978, just before the filming of Voodoo Doll began. The following season, Johnson started appearing in the recurring role of Lieutenant Bree on Battlestar Galactica, and in 1980 began using the name Janet Julian. In last year's EW article, Stevenson and Cassidy related they didn't hold anything against Martin for quitting, and remained friends with her. Stevenson added, "When she left, she just was ready for something else. I think she was frustrated, and probably the momentum of Sean's singing and all that attention kind of took the wind out of their sails a little bit on Nancy Drew." Following Season 2 of Hardy Boys Nancy Drew, however, Pamela Sue Martin's name hit the papers for an entirely different reason. Seeking to distance herself from wholesome teenage roles, Martin appeared in a Playboy photo shoot for the July 1978 issue. The cover photo had her in a trench coat with presumably nothing underneath, holding a magnifying glass. The headline, "TV's Nancy Drew Undraped," appeared to the right. The inside article, where Martin appeared 98% nude, was titled, "Nancy Drew Grows Up." After 2 seasons as TV's teenaged girl detective, Pamela Sue Martin has headed for greener pastures. She was photographed in everything from a transparent teddy to a strategically placed sash of red velvet to almost nothing. There was also a photo with her and Parker Stevenson. For a time, there was press speculation that they were a thing. And one of her in a suit, drinking milk. Pamela's tired of the assumption she's as bland as a glass of milk. In the article interview, she also took the opportunity to criticize how her former role was written. Nancy Drew never cried or experienced an inordinate amount of pain. There was never any tragedy or extreme emotion. Never a kissing scene or any sign that she would indulge with the opposite sex. A big moment for her was coming across an old skeleton in a dungeon and screaming. Or being attacked by a bat in Transylvania. To say that Harriet Adams at the Stratemeyer Syndicate was not pleased would be an understatement. One syndicate writer described her as fit to be tied. After all, Martin was then appearing on the cover of Nancy Drew tie-in books, wearing almost the same hairstyle and trench coat. Adams wished to sue Playboy, but publisher Grosset and Dunlap would not join the syndicate in a lawsuit. Later, in a 1980 court case, instigated when Adams sold publishing rights to G&D competitor Simon & Schuster, Adams testified that she felt the Playboy spread was damaging to the Nancy Drew brand. At the time, Adams settled for running ads denouncing the Playboy article, even running one in Playboy itself. Playboy promised to run a retraction in a future issue, whatever that meant. For Season 3, Nancy Drew was dropped altogether, and the show was just The Hardy Boys. But along with the title change came a significant storyline shift. Now the boys were operating for the Justice Department, answering to Harry Hammond from DC. You might think this would have opened up new opportunities to tell larger stories. But most of the episodes were formulaic and disappointing. Also, all the original flavor of mystery solving was thrown out the window in favor of by-the-numbers, action-oriented plots that could have been episodes of any one of a number of other shows. After 6 aired episodes, ABC chose to put the series out of its misery, but would still air the remaining 3 already in the can. But remember that last episode where I said it seemed like they were going through the motions? As Parker Stevenson revealed in the EW piece, "We were shooting at the end of that 3rd season, and they canceled us. But then there was a dispute between the network and Universal. The contract stipulated that Universal would be paid for one more episode, and they couldn't just cancel it. So they brought us back, after they made us pack up on the set and leave the studio. And then the next day, we were back. We did one last episode, knowing we were canceled.
Sean Cassidy added,
I just remember it was sudden, and I also remember not being terribly disappointed.
Glenn Larson attempted to explain the thinking behind ABC's decision in the Den of Geek article.
ABC got to a point where they had so many hits, they got a little greedy. Battlestar followed the Hardy Boys at one point, and it was awfully expensive. They were looking at the numbers for Mork and Mindy, which were huge, and they said, if we could get a 40 share on a show with one stage, one camera that costs practically nothing, let's move that one to Sunday night. When they moved it, they took out Battlestar, the Hardy Boys, and they canceled the development of Magnum P.I. So in one call, it was like a massacre.
Well, that was how Larson recalled it in 2010. However, the Hardy Boys was canceled in December, and Battlestar Galactica wasn't canceled until March. At least that's when it was announced. But ABC did nix the development of Magnum P.I., and Larson ended up taking the series to CBS. Following the cancellation, ABC filled the slot with the Osmond Family Hour, then with the virtually forgotten lighthearted drama Friends, which was Jill Whelan's first acting credit. The following season, more shows were cycled through the time slot, including the short-lived Salvage 1 and Galactica 1980. But for years, nothing lived up to the acceptable ratings that the Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries had. Larson claimed the network suffered from cancellation remorse, and this seems verified by Parker Stevenson, who ran into an ABC executive years later who reportedly told him,
the biggest mistake I made was canceling your show.
Arlene Sidaris added,
what we had in terms of fan mail and book sales was really impressive, but ABC just didn't pay attention. With all their research and all the money they put into it, they really didn't get the true picture of how successful we really were.
One clue to the success of the series could be seen in the amount of licensed merchandise produced, as there was quite a bit. For $5, viewers could join a fan club for either the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew and receive 2 8x12 autographed photos, 1 5x7 photo, a 4x5 photo, 6 wallet-sized snapshots, a biography, full-color poster, quarterly fan club newsletter, fan club membership scroll, 16x20 full-color poster, and personalized fan club membership card in holder. What a deal! Some early merchandise seems as if it was intended to be solely Sean Cassidy branded, with a Hardy Boys Mysteries logo stamped on as an afterthought. This included an AM radio with microphone and disco amplifier, and toy microphone with amplified speaker, both from Vanity Fair. For 1978, the licensed product options exploded with t-shirts, watches, buttons, jigsaw puzzles, record cases, Collegeville Halloween costumes, a Parker Brothers board game, coloring books, coloring poster kits, stationery sets, greeting cards, a Revel model kit of the Hardy Boys van, dolls by Kenner, a Sean Cassidy guitar, a sing-along record player by Vanity Fair, and a stereo LP record of 2 Hardy Boys adventures. Grosset and Dunlap also produced 2 tie-in novels, one of The Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew Meet Dracula, and the other combining episodes The Haunted House and Flight to Nowhere. Oddly, no Viewmaster reels were released. Likewise, Nancy Drew received a bit of merchandise, but the amount wasn't nearly as prolific. There was a metal lunchbox by Thermos, a wristwatch, jigsaw puzzle, Halloween costume, and Grosset and Dunlap tie-in puzzle books, but not much else that I can find.
The artwork on the Nancy Drew lunchbox and thermos was an oddity, unlike other merchandise which clearly bore the likenesses of the lead actors. The character had a very generic and unflattering appearance, unclear as to what actress was intended to be depicted, if any. All the merchandising was a cash cow for Sean Cassidy in particular, as his $15,000 per episode salary paled in comparison to the reported 7 figures that merchandising royalties pulled in. Hardy Boys Nancy Drew enjoyed a syndication run in the 1980s, then was carried by cable network WOR. The series has had several releases on home video over the years. The pilot episode, The Mystery of the Haunted House, was released on Laserdisc in 1979. In 1985, MCA Universal released 8 of the Hardy Boys episodes, as well as 8 Nancy Drew episodes on VHS and Betamax. In 1987, the previously unreleased 3rd season episode, Search for Atlantis, and 2nd season Nancy Drew episode, The Lady on Thursday at 10, were released from Good Times Home Video. In later years, the show was carried on cable network TV Land. In 2005, the series began to be released as entire seasons on DVD by Universal Studios Home Entertainment. But it took Shout Factory to finally bring out the 3rd season 8 years later. However, the 3rd season episodes on both DVD and Amazon Video are 46-minute syndication cuts, missing 2 to 3 minutes of footage from each episode. This one I'd skip. The show is also currently available on NBC Universal's Peacock streaming service. However, numerous episodes are missing. Why? Our old nemesis, the #1 enemy of classic TV show releases, music clearances. In fact, any episodes with Sean Cassidy vocal performances are missing from the online subscription streaming platforms where they have been carried, while these same episodes remain present on the DVDs. Ditto for Ricky Nelson in The Flickering Torch Mystery, where he sings Garden Party, You Can't Dance, and portions of other songs. Same goes for the season premiere of Season 3, where Joe loses his fiancée, and the 2-part Defection to Paradise, due to the performances by David Gates and Bread. While I've encountered the odd episode here and there not included in series being offered by various online streamers, just try to find One Day at a Time 2nd season episode Happy New Year, where Barbara and Julie sing Don't Go Breaking My Heart. Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries takes the cake with an incredible 24 episodes missing from Peacock. Again, these are present on the DVDs, and if you buy Hardy Boys Season 3 on Amazon Video, all episodes are present. Less noticeable are the number of instances where background music was replaced for the DVDs, which carry over to streaming. Several times in episodes, some very generic music can be heard in various scenes at parties, nightclubs, and so on, such as Nancy Drew's first outing, The Mystery of Pirates Cove, where originally an instrumental version of Chicago's If You Leave Me Now played during the opening party scene, but was replaced with generic dance music. Likewise, the Season 1 finale replaced the original music at a party with something that clearly doesn't match George's dancing. What happened to the people involved in the series? Glenn Larson, of course, went on to be involved in many of the shows we commonly associate with the 80s, such as Magnum P.I., The Fall Guy, Knight Rider, Automan, and The Highwayman. After a long career as one of the most successful TV producers in history, Larson died in 2014 at age 77. Arlene Sidaris joined her husband in producing a number of hard-hitting action films of the 80s and 90s, known by fans to offer bullets, bombs, and babes, such as Malibu Express, Hard Ticket to Hawaii, Savage Beach, Hard Hunted, Fit to Kill, and Day of the Warrior. Although Andy Sidaris left us in 2007, his films remain popular and are now on Blu-ray and streaming. They and related merchandise are available at andysidaris.com, which Arlene continues to operate. Joyce Brotman went on to write over half a dozen TV movies, and for daytime drama, Guiding Light. She also co-authored the children's fantasy book, Larry, the King of Rock and Roll. Parker Stevenson has enjoyed quite a career on television. Among numerous roles have been a run on Falcon Crest, playing genius Austin James on the short-lived but underrated Probe, previously considered on Forgotten TV, and the role he considers his favorite. A run on 90s hit Baywatch, both as an actor and director, and most recently on Netflix's Greenhouse Academy. And did I mention he's an accomplished photographer? Now 72, he maintains an active lifestyle, telling Closer Weekly, "I'm at the beach every day in my real life, jogging, swimming. For 20 years, I went surfing 4 or 5 times a week. Now it's maybe once every 2 weeks." During the Hardy Boys series production, Sean Cassidy released additional albums, 2 of which went platinum. Still, nothing came close to the popularity of his debut album and hit singles Da Do Run Run and That's Rock and Roll. His 4th album, Room Service, even failed to chart on the U.S. Billboard 200. In the wake of its release in the summer of 1979, he largely quit touring. After the cancellation of the Hardy Boys, Sean's last big concert was February 22, 1980, at the Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo at the Astrodome, in front of a crowd of 55,000. Then ABC cast him in a pilot slated to begin filming in March 1980. This was to be a TV adaptation of the successful 1979 theatrical film Breaking Away, a coming-of-age drama about 4 boys on the cusp of adulthood in Bloomington, Indiana. Dave, Mike, Cyril, and Moocher, played by Dennis Christopher, Dennis Quaid, Daniel Stern, and Jackie Earl Haley, respectively, are from working-class families, just graduated from high school, and spend much of their time at an abandoned quarry where they swim and think about what to do with their life. Dave is obsessed with cycling and all things Italian, particularly the Massi bicycle he won in a contest. And the film follows his pursuits of both a university co-ed and an exhibition race where he competes against an Italian cycling team. Cassidy was cast as Dave, replacing Dennis Christopher from the film, while Barbara Barry, Jackie Earl Haley, and John Ashton all reprised their roles. Originally intended as a 2-hour pilot telefilm, the SAG strike of 1980 interrupted these plans, and it did not begin filming until that fall, debuting late in November with a 1-hour pilot episode. The series depicted the events of the year leading up to the film, exploring the lives of Dave and his friends during their final year of high school and the summer after graduation. Their recurring spats with local university frat boys that derisively call them cutters, collectively throwing them in with the local common workers in the limestone industry, was also depicted. The production delay resulted in the show debuting the Saturday after Thanksgiving, with new episodes airing during the holiday season, a tough time to build a new audience. The show was pulled after 7 episodes, leaving an 8th unaired until the show was rerun the following summer. During the 80s and into the 90s, Cassidy focused on stage acting, appearing on Broadway and West End productions. His final stage appearance was opposite his brother David in the Broadway production of Blood Brothers. Around this time, he wrote his first television pilot, American Gothic, for CBS and Universal Television. The show ran a full season in 1995 to 96 and opened the door to further creative opportunities for TV.
The fantasy adventure series Roar with Heath Ledger ran on the Fox network in 1997. Crime drama comedy Cover Me for USA Network in 2000. Sci-fi thriller Invasion for ABC in 2005. And most recently, New Amsterdam in 2018 for NBC, which ran for 5 seasons. In 2019, he got the bug to again perform, returning to the stage with his one-man show, An Evening of Music and Storytelling, selling out venues across the country. Now 66, he has fathered 7 children and lives with his family on a property in the hilly wine country of Santa Barbara, where they have more animals than they can keep track of. In 1981, Pamela Sue Martin joined the cast of Dynasty, portraying spoiled rich girl Fallon Carrington Colby. She also hosted a somewhat lackluster episode of SNL in 1985. But hey, Robert Palmer and the Power Station banged a gong and got it on. After 4 seasons of Dynasty, though, she quit the show, unhappy with a tonal shift that came with a new writing team. After 1990, she walked away from Hollywood almost entirely. As she told Closer Weekly last year, "Some of the decisions I made seemed wrong to other people at the time, but I'd had my fill and just enough money to move on down the road. And I've never really looked back. I wanted to be with animals, ride horses, travel a bit, and have a family. I was able to do all that by leaving." According to a People profile, she joined a polo team, reared horses, and drove around the country in a Volkswagen minibus with her young son. Eventually, she set down her roots in Haley, Idaho, where she became involved with the religious science movement, working as a prayer practitioner. Around 2010, she took up primary residence in Mexico with her boyfriend while still maintaining her Idaho property. Now 71, she can still be drawn out of her acting retirement for the occasional one-off role, usually in a bit of stunt casting. She was last seen in a cameo appearance on the pilot of the CW's Nancy Drew series in 2019, and found time to picket outside Warner Brothers Studios in the SAG-AFTRA strike last year. As far as the Hardy Boys characters, they've remained a touchstone of American popular culture. National Lampoon magazine has parodied the brothers at least twice. In 1971, Chums in the Dark spoofed the Hardy Boys, presenting the young sleuths as hopelessly clueless when it came to matters of sex and drugs, and were literally left holding the bag. In 1985, they ran The Undiscovered Notebooks of Franklin W. Dixon, in which the authors purport to have stumbled upon some unpublished Hardy Boys manuscripts, including The Party Boys and The Case of the Missing Scotch, and The Hardly Boys in the Dark Secret of the Spooky Closet. In 2006, the brothers were immortalized as the Hardly Boys on the South Park episode Mystery of the Urinal Deuce.
The Hardly Boys, 2 young whippersnappers with a knack for solving mysteries. The Hardly Boys in The Mystery of the Urinal Turd. So that's it, Hardly Boys. We've got no leads and nobody admitting to the crime.
That sure is a mystery.
Yeah, it sounds super hard.
Whoever did it must have been angry with the school. Oh. Ooh. I think I'm getting a clue.
Really?
Yeah, this is totally giving me a clue right now.
Oh. I'm starting to get a clue, too.
My clue's kind of pointing this way.
Oh. Yeah, no, I've got a total clue.
The episode satirized the sexless aspect of the Hardy Boys, as they are presented to be ignorant of the fact that the phrases they use had a sexual connotation. In fact, this has been addressed several times. On stage, The Hardy Boys and the Mystery of Where Babies Come From by Christopher Durang has the boys try to figure out how Nancy Drew got pregnant. The Secret of the Old Queen, a Hardy Boys musical by Timothy Cope and Paul Bosing,
played on a gay sexual double entendre theme. While Mabel Maney's novel A Ghost in the Closet, a Hardy Boys mystery, outright presented the boys as a gay couple and included plenty of queer doin's, references to phrasing used in several of the 1920s McFarlane books. Harriet Stratemeyer Adams died in 1982, leaving the Stratemeyer Syndicate to financial partners who ultimately sold it to Simon & Schuster in 1985. The Hardy Boys Mystery Stories series, which spanned 190 volumes, ended its run in 2005. It was replaced with a reboot series, The Hardy Boys Undercover Brothers. In these volumes, the Hardys' adventures are narrated in the first person, each brother alternating chapters. These books had a completely different flavor than the original series and ran until 2012. Simon & Schuster has attempted to keep the characters refreshed with new series since, such as The Hardy Boys' Secret Files and The Hardy Boys Adventures. In 1995, Canadian production company Nelvana attempted another TV adaptation of The Boy Detectives, simply called The Hardy Boys. Starring Canadian actors Colin Gray and Paul Popowich as college-age Frank and Joe, the show aired on French network France 2 and was syndicated to the U.S. This half-hour series featured Joe as a computer hacker and Frank a cub reporter. With Toronto standing in for Bayport, the brothers frequently hung out at a 50s-style diner named F.W. Dixon's. The lackluster series only stuck around for 13 episodes. The 1995 series is available to watch free on Tubi and other platforms. A 2020 Hulu series repackaged the Hardy Boys yet again for current audiences, for the first time presenting a serious age gap with a 16-year-old Frank and 12-year-old Joe. The series also switched up the roles a bit, making younger brother Joe the puzzle-solving intellectual and older brother Frank the jock. The show ran for 3 seasons and 31 episodes. Likewise, Nancy Drew has continued to evolve over the years. Spin-off book series The Nancy Drew Files launched in 1986 and was aimed at a slightly older audience, featuring more romance and adventure. The series saw 124 books released up to 1997. In 1988, the Super Mystery series finally saw a proper crossover with the Hardy Boys in a series of 36 novels that ran until 1998. The Nancy Drew on Campus series in 1995 dealt with Nancy, George, and Bess attending university and were intended for young adults. After 175 books, in 2003, Simon & Schuster ended the run of the original series and rebooted it as Girl Detective, reinventing Nancy Drew for the 21st century. Nancy Drew has also seen more film and TV adaptations over the years than The Boy Detectives. In 1995, Nelvana produced a Nancy Drew series, running concurrently with the Hardy Boys show already mentioned. With Tracy Ryan in the lead role, this version saw Nancy as a criminology student in New York City. Friends Bess, George, and Ned all made it into this adaptation, also a half-hour in length and intended to be shown in a 1-hour block together with the Hardy Boys. However, even crossing over the characters for the final 2 episodes wasn't enough to save these shows, and Nancy Drew died alongside the Hardy Boys after 13 episodes. This series is also available to watch free on Tubi and other platforms, although if you look it up on Amazon Video, the thumbnail used is that of Pamela Sue Martin and not Tracy Ryan. Don't get me started on the bizarre choices of Amazon Video thumbnail images.
Next on ABC.
I got a scoop.
It's a too-hot-to-handle scandal that only this college girl can break wide open.
Drew,
Nancy Drew.
But her biggest case
That's not a crime. Buzzing them up for a big game.
could be her last.
You think they won't seek retribution?
The world premiere movie, Nancy Drew. ABC Next.
A December 2002 telefilm airing on ABC had Nancy, Bess, and George as college freshmen at River Heights University. When the star football player goes into a coma, Nancy finds a campus-wide conspiracy and a fraternity's drug use. This was another production I was completely unaware of until I researched this podcast. While lead actress Maggie Lawson wasn't exactly evoking Alicia Silverstone, the fast-paced scenes of Nancy at college and her dynamic with Bess and George seemed heavily modeled after 1995's Clueless. When ABC didn't pick this up as a series, it was offered to UPN. But they also passed, as Maggie Lawson had been cast in new series It's All Relative, airing the fall of 2003 on ABC. The film was dedicated to original Nancy Drew writer Mildred Wirt Benson, who died in May of that year.
In the town of River Heights, there's no mystery that Nancy Drew can't solve.
In 2007, Warner Brothers released Nancy Drew, featuring 15-year-old Nickelodeon star Emma Roberts in the title role. The film has Nancy move to Los Angeles, where her father is away on an extended business trip, and she stumbles across evidence of the unsolved murder of a movie star. 2016's Drew, a failed CBS pilot with Sarah Shahi from Person of Interest, featured a Nancy in her 30s, living in New York City, now a police detective with the uncanny ability to solve complex crimes. While the pilot tested well, CBS rejected the series for being too female for the network. The following year, CBS tried to redevelop the concept with a middle-aged Nancy, now an author who had written books about her own adventures, but this version never made it to pilot stage. In 2019, Nancy Drew fans had their cup runneth over with both a theatrical film and a new TV series for the CW.
Since moving to this nowhere town, I'm still waiting for an ounce of excitement.
Nancy Drew! Check it out.
The creepy Twin Elms house has gone viral. Finally, things are about to get a little more interesting.
Nancy Drew and the Hidden Staircase featured Sophia Lillis in the role and tread on familiar ground as she investigated a haunted house in this new adaptation of the 1930 book. Produced by Ellen DeGeneres and released to theaters in March, it was a mega bomb for Warner. Initially intended as the launching pad for a new film series, no development on any new Nancy Drew films has been announced. The series that started airing in October 2019 starred Kennedy McMahon as Nancy Drew, who heads up a reimagined group of characters from the books, collectively called the Drew Crew, played by a multiracial cast. Nancy and most of the characters all work at a diner called the Bayside Claw. Series development reportedly started at CBS before moving to NBC, then finally the CW. The series began with a story arc investigating the murder of a local socialite, where Nancy learns disturbing truths about her own background. However, this version seemed like a significant departure from the original concept, presenting darker themes and mature content, not to mention supernatural and horror elements, including ghosts, curses, and witchcraft. Interestingly, a spin-off series titled Tom Swift aired in 2022, with Tian Richards in the title role. And yes, this was based on the original Stratemeyer Syndicate book series that debuted 112 years earlier in 1910. Unfortunately, this series only ran for 10 episodes before cancellation. The CW's Nancy Drew ran for 4 seasons and 62 episodes, ending its run in August of 2023. Alongside Zorro and Buck Rogers, the Hardy Boys and Nancy Drew remain some of the oldest fictional characters that are still around in pop culture. From the early days of the Depression-era books to the films of the 1930s and subsequent TV and film incarnations, something about these characters clearly resonates with the reader or viewer. Perhaps their appeal lies in their relatability. With no superpowers or ray guns, young readers and viewers can see themselves in these resourceful, determined characters, solving mysteries and making a difference in their own world. As the characters can be continually adapted and reinvented for new audiences, one thing's for sure: we haven't seen the last of the Hardy Boys or Nancy Drew on our screens. Coming in 2025 to Forgotten TV.
This is Earth. Earth 2. The last hurrah of a dying planet, or the Noah's Ark of an intergalactic age.
You're in a house, maybe your own, maybe one you've never seen before. You feel it. Something evil. You run, but there's no escape, nowhere to turn. You feel something beckoning you, draw you into the terror that awaits you in the dark room.
Podcasts on The Magician, Earth 2, Misfits of Science, Dark Room. It's your move, and we'll even likely be revisiting a forgotten TV favorite with new interviews. Stay tuned to Forgotten TV in 2025. Forgotten TV is an independent, listener-supported podcast. Hey, don't skip this segment. Probably the number one thing you can do to support Forgotten TV is by following on Patreon, even if as a free member, which you can now do. This will put you on the mailing list to be notified of content and additional articles that are published. Please consider becoming a paid supporter so I can spend more time doing this. You can do this through either Patreon or PayPal and become a producer of the show, or buy me a coffee by clicking the link right here in the show notes. I'm also putting out daily content now on 70s and 80s TV history, which you can read by following on Facebook, X, the artist formerly known as Twitter, Blue Sky, or even LinkedIn. Expanded articles get posted on Patreon, so that's a great reason to support there. See show notes for links. Forgotten TV is executive produced by Doc Pinko, Joshua Driscoll, K.L. Young, Kenny Siegel, and Tony Cook. With producers Trevor Pearson, Mark Hadley, Tim Yabo, Lee Goldberg, and James Bellinger. And of course, thanks to all who support at the $1 and $2 levels. Forgotten TV is not affiliated with or authorized by Universal Television, Glenn A. Larson Productions, ABC, Grosset & Dunlap, Simon & Schuster, or any production company or network involved in the making of any TV show or film mentioned in this podcast. Links to Amazon are affiliate, and as an Amazon associate, Forgotten TV earns royalties from qualifying purchases made. All characters and series mentioned are the property of their respective copyright holders, and no infringement is intended. Audio clips included are for the purposes of historical context, review, commentary, and criticism only, and are not intended to infringe. Additional audio used under license by Epidemic Sound. If you need music for your podcast or YouTube channel, check out Epidemic Sound. Link in the show notes.
Amazing Plan by Kevin MacLeod, used under a Creative Commons Attribution 3.0 license. This podcast is copyright 2024 Forgotten TV Media. The views and opinions expressed by guests and quoted sources are their own and may not reflect the opinion of Forgotten TV Media, its patrons, or any future sponsors. This podcast is intended for entertainment purposes only. Information presented is based on a combination of first-hand personal accounts, period news media, books and magazine articles, and high-quality online sources. While reasonable effort has been made to include only factual information, Forgotten TV Media cannot guarantee the accuracy of every detail included and makes no representations or warranties for the content in this podcast and cannot be held liable for errors or omissions. Special thanks to Arlene, Sidaris, and Joyce Brotman for their contributions. Additionally, I'd like to in particular acknowledge the research of Mark Connolly, David Konow, and Kristen Baldwin. And I'd like to thank the following YouTube channels for making some of that audio possible. Two Reeler, Is This Name Took? Warner Brothers Classics, Short New, Keeping Walt in Disney, Vintage TV Commercials, Scott Reppert, Jan Edio, The Hardy Boys Topic, The Rap Sheet, Trailers from Hell, Bionic Disco, 11DB11, Bread Topic, TV's Greatest, NBC Classics, 70s Kid Vid, TikTok 70, David Gideon, Digit Works, Mr. T, Retroist Commercials, Classic Television Fan, Sean Cassidy Topic, David Cassidy Topic, Fictional Music, Madman Films, The Film Crypt, Mike Beckwith, Baywatch, The Spirit of Orchestral Music, Glamour Trailers, Agothics, Retro Rerun, Legits, Childhood Memories, Rotten Tomatoes Classic Trailers, Rotten Tomatoes Trailers, Krypton Boy Music Videos, MGX Flick. Quotes and background information not given directly to Forgotten TV were obtained from the following sources: the books and printed materials. The Hardy Boys Mysteries, 1927 to 1979, A Cultural and Literary History by Mark Connolly. Girl Sleuth, Nancy Drew and the Women Who Created Her by Melanie Rehack. The Boy Detectives, Essays on the Hardy Boys and Others, edited by Michael G. Korn. Ghost of the Hardy Boys, the writer behind the world's most famous boy detectives, by Leslie McFarlane. The Secret of the Hardy Boys, Leslie McFarlane and the Stratemeyer Syndicate, by Marilyn Greenwald. Lou Scheimer, Creating the Filmation Generation, by Lou Scheimer and Andy Mangels. Could It Be Forever? My Story, by David Cassidy. Mothers, Guard Your Girls. The new Cassidy on the Loose is David's kid brother Sean. People Magazine, July 4th, 1977. The Death of a Teeny Bopper by Dave Thompson, Goldmine Magazine. And content from the following online sources: The Hardy Boys Nancy Drew Mysteries article by David Konow at Den of Geek, April 2010. The Case of the Dreamy Detectives. Sean Cassidy and Parker Stevenson Remember the Hardy Boys by Kristen Baldwin at Entertainment Weekly, May 2023. The Naughty Nostalgia of the Hardy Boys series by Brandon Tinsley at The Atlantic. The Hardy Boys unofficial homepage and the Nancy Drew unofficial homepage, maintained by Robert Finnan. The Nancy Drew Sleuth blog, maintained by Jen Fisher, as well as various articles at The Hardy Boys Wiki, Art of Manliness, NPR, DV Dizzy, Vice, Smithsonian, Screen Rant, Kinder Trauma, Television Obscurities, Saturday Mornings Forever, Pipe and PJ's Pictorials, VTV, Grunge, The Hollywood Reporter, and Closer Weekly. Thank you for listening. Be sure and bookmark Forgotten.tv for all content and links. I am your writer, producer, and host, Chris Cooling, and this has been Forgotten TV.
Hardy Boys, two young whippersnappers with a taste for solving mystery. The Hardy Boys in The Case of the World Trade Center Conspiracy. So that's about the long and short of it, Hardy Boys. There were two towers that stood right here, and they're gone.
And nobody knows who's responsible?
There are theories, but nobody's certain.
Who would benefit most from two buildings disappearing?
Ooh. Oh, I just started getting a clue.
Really?
Yeah, I'm totally getting a clue.
Yo!